For 10,000 years, one fortress world stood between humanity and annihilation. A planet where children learned to fire lasguns before they could read, where violet skies never darkened, where endless vigilance was the only way of life. When Abaddon the Despoiler finally came with his 13th Black Crusade, he didn't just want to conquer Cadia, he came to erase it from existence. Faith endures longer than worlds. In the seething madness beyond the veil of reality, where gods and nightmares feed upon the souls of mortals, there exists a wound in the universe. The Eye of Terror, a vast cosmic maelstrom where the immaterial bleeds into the material, where the laws of physics surrender to the whims of malice. For 10 millennia, the Imperium of man held this abomination at bay, not through prayer alone, though countless billions knelt before the Golden Throne in supplication, but through the sacrifice of a single world that stood sentinel at the edge of oblivion. Cadia. The name itself became a prayer, an invocation of defiance whispered across 10,000 years of desperate vigil. A fortress not merely of stone and steel, but of human resolve cast in forms so unyielding that even the gods of chaos grew to know fear. The histories recorded in the sealed archives of the Administratum tell of how this world came to stand at the threshold of nightmare, not by choice or chance, but by the cruel symmetry of cosmic fate that placed this unremarkable orb precisely where reality required a sentinel. Long before the birth of the Imperium, before mankind reached for the stars in vessels of hope rather than desperation, something ancient recognized the strategic value of this nexus. The Old Ones, perhaps, or one of countless species erased from memory by time's merciless procession. They raised monoliths of impossible black stone across Cadia's surface, pylons that reached toward the void like accusatory fingers, their purpose encoded in mathematics that would not be deciphered for eons. These structures, which came to be known as the Blackstone Pylons, somehow calmed the raging tempest of the warp nearby, creating a narrow corridor of relative stability through which vessels might pass. A gate, though none could have foreseen the horrors that would one day seek to force it open. When the Emperor's Great Crusade swept outward from Terra to reclaim humanity's lost dominion among the stars, Cadia was merely one conquest among thousands. Imperial records indicate it was the 89th Expeditionary Fleet that brought the planet to compliance in the early years of the 30th millennium. They found a primitive human culture already shaped by proximity to the warp anomaly, though none then could have predicted how this proximity would forge these people into living weapons over the millennia to come. The first colonization proceeded with mechanical precision. The Mechanicum established manufactory complexes to exploit mineral resources. The Imperial Army constructed garrison facilities to maintain security. Administratum adepts catalogued every aspect of the new acquisition for the Emperor's ledgers. All proceeded according to the clinical patterns of imperial expansion, the fate of this world not yet written in the blood of generations unborn. Then came the sundering, the great betrayal. The War Master Horus, most favored son of the Emperor, turned his face from the light and embraced the very powers his father had sought to protect humanity from. Among his followers were Chaos Space Marines of the Wordbearer's Legion, who had hidden the seeds of their corruption for decades. These traitors had secretly constructed temples and monuments to dark gods beneath Cadian soil, consecrating the world in blasphemous rituals long before the heresy erupted into open war. When Horus fell and his forces retreated before the Emperor's wrath, many fled into the anomaly that would later be named the Eye of Terror. Cadia, positioned at its threshold, became the final imperial world they passed a doorway both into and out of madness. In the chaotic aftermath of the heresy, as the Imperium struggled to reconsolidate, strategic planners recognized with growing dread what this world must become. No longer merely a conquered planet, but the linchpin upon which the security of the Imperium would rest. The fortification of Cadia began in earnest during the early years of the 31st millennium under the oversight of the newly established Adeptus Terra. Every aspect of the world was methodically transformed to serve its new purpose. Natural mountain ranges were reshaped into defensive cordons. Seas were drained to create firing plains with unobstructed fields of vision stretching hundreds of kilometers. The very crust of the planet was reinforced with adamantium buttresses to withstand bombardment from weapons designed to crack worlds. The Mechanicum, later the Adeptus Mechanicus, devoted vast resources to understanding the ancient pylons that dotted the landscape. Though their true function remained elusive, empirical evidence confirmed their stabilizing effect on the nearby warp anomaly. Additional defensive infrastructure was constructed around each pylon cluster, recognizing their strategic value even without comprehending their mechanisms. Explorator missions collected data for centuries, building mathematical models that approached but never quite captured the fundamental principles by which these structures functioned. While machines and fortifications might form a world's bones, it is flesh and blood that must ultimately stand against the darkness. The people of Cadia underwent a transformation more profound than any reshaping of their planet's geography. The initial colonists were systematically replaced through controlled immigration programs, bringing in population stock selected for specific genetic traits. Psychological resilience, physical endurance, heightened pattern recognition, and resistance to warp. Influence. Within 3 generations, a distinctive Cadian phenotype began to emerge, a people genetically adapted to stand at the threshold of hell without surrendering their humanity. Most visible were the eyes, unnaturally purple, a trait speculated to result from subtle warp exposure combined with genetic drift in an isolated population. More significant were the unseen adaptations: neurological structures resistant to fear stimuli, enhanced adrenal response systems, and subtle alterations to the brain's reality filtering mechanisms that allowed Cadians to witness horrors that would drive ordinary humans to madness. By the dawn of the 32nd millennium, Cadian society had been wholly remade to serve its purpose. Children born on this world entered a life predetermined from their first breath. They learned to field strip lasguns before they could read, mastered small unit tactics before arithmetic, and memorized the 812 recognized signs of chaos corruption before their 10th year. Education was indistinguishable from military training, all civilian pursuits subordinated to the demands of eternal vigilance. The violet skies of Cadia, perpetually illuminated by the baleful light of the eye, served as a constant reminder of the world's purpose. Generations lived and died beneath that unnatural aurora, never knowing the simple comfort of true night or the innocent wonder of clear stars. Instead, they watched the swirling patterns overhead for changes that might herald incursion, their eyes ever lifted toward the threat rather than downcast in despair. The Imperium's spiritual apparatus recognized the unique psychological challenges presented by this environment. The Adeptus Ministorum established an unusually strong presence on Cadia, with cathedral fortresses constructed alongside military installations. Faith became inseparable from duty, each reinforcing the other in a pragmatic symbiosis. Cadians did not merely believe in the Emperor's protection, they embodied it through disciplined action and unflinching sacrifice. Their prayers were not pleas for deliverance, but affirmations of purpose, recited in the rhythmic cadence of weapons drills. Only in death does duty end. This common imperial maxim found its purest expression in Cadian culture, where children were taught that their lives belonged not to themselves, but to the Emperor and the Imperium he had established. To die defending Cadia was not merely honorable, but expected the culmination of purpose rather than its interruption. Names of the fallen were meticulously recorded in vast memorial databases, not primarily as acts of remembrance but as statistical measures of the price paid for continued survival. As the centuries passed, the castles of Cadia rose from the disciplined landscape, massive city fortresses designed not for comfort or commerce but for optimal defense. Each was a self-contained military installation capable of sustaining itself during prolonged siege, with walls hundreds of meters high and foundations that reached deep into the planetary crust. Streets were laid out to create interlocking fields of fire, public spaces designed to serve as emergency landing pads for aircraft, civilian housing constructed to convert into bunkers within hours of alert. Casa d'Earth, Kaza Jark, Kaza Holn, Kaza Tyrok, Kaza Gallon, Kaza Sonnen, Kaza Myrak. These names entered Imperial military lexicon as bywords for impregnability. Each Kaza developed its own martial traditions and regimental identities while maintaining absolute loyalty to the Cadian command structure. Friendly rivalries between Kazas were encouraged as motivational tools, driving each to prove its superior devotion through measurable combat effectiveness rather than mere words. From these fortress cities emerged the regiments that would become legendary throughout the Imperium, the Cadian shock troops. Clad in their distinctive carapace armor of olive drab and khaki, these were not merely soldiers but living embodiments of imperial doctrine, each man and woman a product of generational conditioning that produced warriors of unmatched discipline. The Departamento Munitorum calculated that a single Cadian regiment possessed combat effectiveness equivalent to 3 regiments drawn from most other worlds, a fact reflected in the disproportionate representation of Cadian officers throughout the wider Astra Militarum command structure. Beyond the settled regions patrolled the Cadian Interior Guard specialized units tasked with monitoring the vast wilderness zones where the ancient pylons stood. These soldiers lived in isolated outposts for years at a time, vigilantly observing the mysterious structures for changes or signs of tampering. They developed unique expertise in detecting subtle warp phenomena, becoming living instruments calibrated to register disturbances too slight for mechanical auspex arrays to detect. Many exhibited minor psychic talents after prolonged exposure to the pylons, though such manifestations were rigorously monitored for corruption. The Interior Guard maintained detailed records of each pylon's status, establishing baseline measurements and tracking deviations over centuries. Though the Adeptus Mechanicus jealously guarded the most esoteric research into these artifacts, practical observational data was shared with Cadian military authorities as a matter of strategic necessity. This collaboration, unusual in an Imperium fragmented by institutional mistrust, testified to the recognized importance of understanding these structures that somehow held the Eye of Terror in check. Orbital defenses completed Cadia's transformation into the most formidable fortress world in the Imperium. A dense network of void stations, defense platforms and minefields created a 3-dimensional killing ground extending thousands of kilometers beyond the planet's atmosphere. The Cadian Gate, as the navigable corridor through this region came to be known, could be sealed by overlapping fields of fire from hundreds of weapon batteries, each capable of crippling capital ships with concentrated salvos. Fleet anchorages maintained permanent battle fleet presence, including specialized vessels designed for sustained operations near warp anomalies. Yet for all this martial preparation, all this transformation of an entire world into a weapon of defense, the true strength of Cadia lay not in its fortifications or armies, but in something far less tangible. Something that could not be measured by the Adeptus Mechanicus or quantified in Departamento Munitorum assessments. It was the quality that emerged in the collective soul of a people who lived every moment in the shadow of annihilation yet refused to be defined by fear. Who raised their children within sight of hell yet taught them to stand straight-backed and clear-eyed. Who buried their dead in soils perpetually vibrating with the distant screams of the warp yet continued to plant crops for harvests they might not live to reap. The Cadian spirit became something studied by imperial scholars and whispered about by enemies, an almost metaphysical fortitude that seemed to transcend mere human resilience. For nearly 10 millennia, this fortitude would be tested, not in single apocalyptic confrontation but through relentless, grinding pressure through endless probing attacks and devastating crusades launched from the Eye of Terror. Each assault reshaped Cadian society, scarring it, hardening it, but never breaking it. The names and methods of the enemy changed across the millennia, but Cadia's response remained the same, unyielding resistance. By the 41st millennium, no living Cadian could recall a time before war. Their world had been under direct or indirect assault for longer than most human civilizations had existed. The cycle of attack and recovery, of destruction and rebuilding, had become so fundamental to their existence that the brief Periods between major chaos incursions were not experienced as peace but merely as preparation for the next inevitable onslaught. Cadians did not hope for an end to conflict. Such concepts belonged to softer worlds, whose populations could afford the luxury of optimism. They hoped only to continue standing when others would have fallen. The Blackstone pylons, those ancient, enigmatic structures that had first drawn mankind to this world, remained at the center of Cadian strategic doctrine throughout the millennia of vigil. Though their fundamental principles eluded even the most dedicated tech priests, empirical evidence confirmed their crucial role in maintaining the stability of the Cadian Gate. Patterns of chaos incursion corresponded with measurable fluctuations in the pylon's energy emissions. Failed attacks correlated with periods of increased pylon activity. Successful breaches of Cadian defenses invariably occurred when the pylons exhibited signs of diminished function. Gradually, a symbiotic relationship developed between these alien artifacts and the human defenders who protected them without fully understanding what they guarded. Cadian battle doctrine evolved to prioritize pylon defense above all other tactical considerations. Regiment commanders learned to interpret changes in the violet auroras above as indicators of pylon status, adjusting deployments based on atmospheric phenomena that had no place in standard imperial military texts. The Interior Guard developed rituals officially discouraged as potentially heretical but tacitly permitted as effective that seemed to stabilize pylon function during periods of heightened warp activity. What none could know, not even the most senior magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus or the most prophetically gifted psyker of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, was that the pylons were failing. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, but with the glacial inevitability of entropy working upon systems designed to last. Eons, but not eternity. Microscopic fractures spread through crystalline matrices, buried kilometers beneath the surface. Quantum-entangled fields sustained by technologies predating humanity's first hesitant steps beyond Terra, weakened by immeasurable increments with each passing century. The mathematical harmonics that allowed these structures to impose material reality's laws upon the lawless warp grew gradually, imperceptibly discordant. For 10,000 years, Cadia stood as the Imperium's bulwark against the gathered might of chaos. For 10,000 years, generations of Cadians lived and died defending a world that existed only to be defended. For 10,000 years, the ancient pylons held back the tide of madness that perpetually threatened to engulf the material universe. But nothing of mortal construction, or even the construction of those ancient beings who preceded mortality, can endure forever unchanged. The final test of Cadian resolve approached not as a sudden storm, but as the culmination of processes set in motion at the very beginning of their vigil. The 13th time Abaddon the Despoiler emerged from the Eye of Terror, leading the largest chaos force ever recorded in Imperial history. He came with knowledge accumulated across 12 previous crusades. Knowledge of weaknesses in Cadian defenses, of patterns in Imperial response, and most crucially, of the true nature and purpose of the Blackstone pylons. Knowledge that transformed what might have been merely another devastating attack into something far more final. But that apocalyptic conclusion remained yet unwritten as the 41st millennium drew toward its end. Cadia still stood, its people still maintained their vigilance, the pylons still imposed their mysterious influence upon the fabric of reality. The sentinel at the abyss had weathered every previous storm. None who lived upon that fortress world could have conceived that their generation would be the one to witness the end of their active 10,000-year vigil. None could have known that future imperial historians would look back upon their time as the final chapter in the chronicle of Cadia, the world that stood until it could stand no more, whose fall would tear the Imperium in two and usher in an age of unprecedented darkness. None could have foreseen that their world, designed as an immovable object, would finally meet the irresistible force it had been created to withstand. Such knowledge was mercifully withheld from those who would face the end. They continued their preparations with the same grim determination that had characterized their ancestors, unaware that they alone among countless generations of Cadians would fail in their sacred duty. unaware that despite this failure, their final stand would become the stuff of legend, a testament to human courage that would inspire resistance across a divided Imperium for centuries to come. For while worlds may die, faith endures. While fortresses may fall, duty remains. And while Cadia would ultimately be destroyed in physical form, the ideal it represented would achieve a kind of immortality in the battle cry that would echo across countless worlds in the dark days to follow. Cadia stands. Duty outlasts memory. 10,000 years of constant vigilance cannot be measured in mere chronology. Time transforms differently on a world where every generation is born knowing they will likely die in battle, where the concept of peace exists only as an abstract theological principle found in ancient texts. On Cadia, time was measured not in standard Terran years but in the spaces between attacks, in the brief respirations between one wave of horror and the next. The fortification of flesh and spirit that occurred during these intervals proved as crucial to Cadia's endurance as any physical bulwark of rockcrete and adamantium. The fortress cities of Cadia, the mighty castles that dominated the disciplined landscape, evolved over millennia of practical experience. Each assault from the Eye of Terror taught bitter lessons written in blood and fire. Each reconstruction incorporated these lessons into physical form. The earliest casas, established during the 31st millennium, followed standard imperial military templates. By the 32nd millennium, distinctly Cadian architectural principles had emerged, designs that prioritized not merely defensibility, but adaptability to the unique horrors that poured from the eye. Kasr Kraf, rebuilt 8 times across the millennia, exemplified the pinnacle of this evolution. Its outer walls rose 300 meters above the perfectly leveled glacis that surrounded it, presenting no cover for approaching forces. These walls, 30 meters thick at their narrowest point, contain not solid rockcrete, but layered chambers filled with ablative materials designed to absorb and dissipate energy from both conventional and warp-based weaponry. Between these chambers ran a labyrinth of corridors and fighting positions that allowed defenders to continue resistance even if sections of wall were breached. Beyond the physical lay the metaphysical. The Adeptus Ministorum and Adeptus Mechanicus collaborated in the consecration of Cadian fortifications to a degree unprecedented elsewhere in the Imperium. Ecclesiarchy priests blessed every stone before placement, while tech priests embedded microscopic votive circuits throughout the structure. Hexagrammic wards were incorporated into foundation templates, and sanctified oils mixed into ceramite bonding agents. Whether such measures provided tangible protection against warp entities remained a subject of doctrinal debate, but the psychological reassurance they offered defenders could not be quantified. Streets within the casas followed geometric patterns that military theorists across the Imperium studied with reverence. Nothing was placed without purpose. Residential hab blocks featured reinforced corners precisely positioned to create interlocking fields of fire down major thoroughfares. Public plazas doubled as landing zones for Valkyrie assault carriers, their decorative fountains concealing promethium reserves for refueling operations. Even sewer systems were designed with defense in mind, their access points aligned with pre-registered artillery coordinates to eliminate infiltrators with minimal communication requirements. The urban warfare doctrine that evolved within these fortress cities became known throughout the Imperium as the Cadian pattern, a methodology so effective it was exported to other worlds, despite the significant architectural modifications required for implementation. Cadian officers seconded to the Departamento Munitorum as advisors commanded premium rates, their expertise in defensive urbanism considered worth any price when a hive world faced potential invasion. Between the casas stretched the meticulously maintained killing grounds of the Cadian wilderness. Natural features had long been reshaped to serve tactical purposes, creating landscapes where every ridge, depression, and watercourse contributed to defensive positioning. Forests were cultivated in uniform grids, their trees genetically modified for rapid growth after inevitable immolation, providing renewable cover for defenders, while their precise spacing eliminated concealment advantages for attackers unfamiliar with local topography. The Cadian interior guard patrolled these interstitial zones with methodical thoroughness, maintaining a network of hardened outposts from which they monitored both the ancient pylons and the approaches to major population centers. These soldiers lived ascetic lives even by Cadian standards, often spending years without entering a casa, becoming so attuned to the natural rhythms of their patrol sectors that they could detect anomalies imperceptible to mechanical auspex arrays. Many developed heightened sensitivity to warp fluctuations, a trait carefully monitored by accompanying commissars for signs of corruption but valued for its early warning capabilities. Within this militarized environment, Cadian society developed distinctive cultural practices that reinforced their martial purpose. Most notable was the system of youth conditioning that began literally from birth. Newborn infants were subject to subtle hypno-indoctrination, their developing minds exposed to subliminal combat stimuli and loyalist conditioning even in the cradle. By the time they could walk, Cadian children entered the first stage of what would be lifelong military training. The white shields represented the formal induction of Cadian youth into the defense of their world. Upon reaching adolescence, every Cadian, regardless of prior aptitude or social status, entered this corps for a minimum 2-year term of intensive preparation. They wore distinctive half-white, half-Cadian green helmets, signifying their transitional status, not quite civilians, but not yet full soldiers. The white portion would be painted the standard Cadian green only when they had drawn enemy blood, a rite of passage that transformed children into defenders in both practical and ceremonial terms. White Shield training evolved over millennia, incorporating lessons from each Black Crusade and countless smaller incursions. The fundamental principle remained consistent: expose initiates to controlled horror to inoculate them against the psychological trauma of actual chaos encounters. Training grounds included chambers where mild warp fluctuations were permitted under strict psycho monitoring, allowing youths to experience the disorienting effects of reality distortion without risk of actual corruption. Servitors reconfigured to simulate various chaos entities engaged initiates in combat exercises, using non-lethal but pain-inducing weapons, teaching them to fight through the shock of encountering non-Euclidean anatomies and physics-defying movements. The psychological conditioning extended beyond combat preparation into every aspect of Cadian development. Education systems emphasized collective identity over individual achievement. Historical instruction focused exclusively on military engagements, with particular attention to instances where individual failure had compromised unit effectiveness. Theological curriculum stressed the emperor's martial aspects, presenting devotion and discipline as inseparable concepts. Even recreation took militarized forms, with popular sports designed to develop combat-applicable skills and team cohesion rather than providing genuine leisure. This comprehensive conditioning produced human beings fundamentally different from imperial citizens elsewhere. Inquisitorial psychological assessments conducted across multiple centuries confirmed that Cadians processed fear differently at a neurological level. Where citizens of other worlds experienced instinctive terror when confronted with warp entities, Cadians exhibited controlled aggression, responses mediated through training reflexes. Their brains showed distinctive adaptation in the amygdala and prefrontal cortex regions, physiological changes theorized to result from generations living under the influence of both the Eye of Terror and the ancient pylons that stood against it. Some inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus quietly questioned whether such adaptation represented a form of sanctioned mutation, and if so, whether it might eventually create vulnerability to certain types of chaos influence. These concerns remained theoretical, as Cadian regiments consistently demonstrated lower corruption rates than troops from any other world when deployed against warp entities. Whatever changes had occurred in the Cadian psyche, they appeared to reinforce resistance rather than receptivity to chaos influence. The purple eyes of Cadia, that distinctive genetic marker visible in nearly all native-born citizens, became a source of both pride and practical value. Medicae research confirmed these uniquely pigmented irises possessed superior low-light sensitivity and unusual resilience against warp-induced hallucinations. More significantly, subtle variations in this purple coloration proved reliable indicators of warp exposure levels, allowing experienced commissars to identify soldiers requiring preemptive screening for corruption. What had begun as a simple mutation became, through careful selection and monitoring, a biological defense mechanism integrated into Cadian security protocols. As Cadia's strategic importance to the Imperium increased across the millennia, so too did the resources allocated to its defense. The orbital infrastructure expanded from simple monitoring stations to a comprehensive three-dimensional battle space encompassing hundreds of void installations. Defense platforms larger than many Imperial cruisers formed the outer perimeter, their massive weapon batteries capable of engaging targets attempting to translate from the warp directly into the Cadian system. Void shields of unprecedented power protected these platforms, generators occupying nearly 60% of their internal volume to sustain energy fields that could withstand prolonged bombardment. Between these outer sentinels and Cadia itself orbited rings of lesser defensive installations. Targeting arrays, mine layers, torpedo platforms, and rapid response bases created a layered defense requiring attackers to expend significant resources even before engaging planetary installations. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintained several specialized orbital forges dedicated exclusively to defense production and repair operations. Their manufacturing capacity focused on rapidly replacing losses during extended engagements. Battlefleet Cadia maintained permanent station in system, its strength periodically supplemented by detachments from other Battlefleet Gothic elements during periods of elevated threat. These naval forces conducted constant patrol operations, their routes calculated to provide optimal coverage of approach vectors while minimizing predictability. Special training protocols developed for void combat near the eye ensured crews could function effectively despite the perceptual distortions and equipment malfunctions common in regions of heightened warp influence. The ground-based defenses matched this orbital fortification in scale and sophistication. Macro cannon emplacements dotted the landscape, many concealed beneath false geographic features until activated for firing. Void shield generators created overlapping protective domes above major casas, their power requirements met by geothermal taps that reached deep into Cadia's mantle. Larger fields ringed population centers, massive earthworks designed to channel attacking forces into pre-registered kill zones covered by redundant defensive positions. These physical defenses, impressive as they were, constituted only the visible manifestation of Cadia's preparedness. The logistical infrastructure that sustained them represented an equally monumental achievement. Underground storage facilities contained munitions and supplies sufficient to maintain maximum defense intensity for years without external resupply. Hydroponic cultivation centers, hardened against orbital bombardment, ensured food production could continue regardless of surface conditions. Medicae facilities included extensive gene banks containing tissue samples from the population, allowing rapid cloning of replacement organs for wounded defenders. The Departamento Munitorum maintained a permanent administrative presence on Cadia, larger than those assigned to entire subsectors elsewhere in the Imperium. This bureaucratic apparatus coordinated the flow of resources, personnel, and information with mechanical efficiency, ensuring that the Cadian war machine operated at optimal capacity. Strategic prognosticators analyzed millennia of defense data, identifying patterns in chaos attack methodologies and developing countermeasures for implementation during future incursions. Within this system of systems, the Cadian shock troops represented the final and most crucial element of the world's defense. These were not merely soldiers, but the physical embodiment of Cadia's defiance, human weapons forged through selective breeding, lifelong training, and battlefield experience passed down through generations. Their distinctive uniforms of olive, drab, and khaki, their disciplined formations, and their unwavering resolve became symbols recognized across the Imperium and beyond, inspiring allies and instilling dread in enemies. The regimental structure of the Cadian military evolved distinct characteristics over the millennia of continuous war. Unlike Imperial Guard forces from other worlds, Cadian regiments maintained bloodline continuity, with positions often passing from parent to child across dozens of generations. This practice, technically in violation of standard Departamento Munitorum protocols designed to prevent formation of dynastic loyalties, received special dispensation due to its demonstrated effectiveness in preserving tactical knowledge and unit cohesion. Certain squad and company designations acquired near mythological status, their battle honors stretching back hundreds of generations, creating lineages of war that constituted a form of nobility unique to Cadian culture. Training methods for these elite troops underwent continuous refinement based on combat data. The infamous White Shield shock exercises, where adolescent recruits faced live fire conditions with minimal warning, served as only the foundation of a progressive conditioning program that continued throughout a soldier's career. Veterans underwent periodic re-indoctrination, incorporating lessons from recent engagements, ensuring tactical flexibility despite the inherent conservatism of Cadian military tradition. Special emphasis was placed on anti-demon protocols, with soldiers memorizing the identifying characteristics and vulnerabilities of thousands of warp entities catalogued during previous incursions. The psychological resilience of Cadian troops became legendary throughout the Imperium. Commissars assigned to their regiments rarely needed to employ summary execution to maintain morale, as Cadian discipline was largely self-enforcing through internalized cultural expectations. When commissarial intervention did occur, it typically addressed tactical hesitation rather than courage failures. Cadians more often needed restraining from excessive aggression than motivation to advance. This phenomenon, documented across thousands of campaigns beyond their homeworld, reflected the fundamental alterations to standard human psychology that Cadian military culture had achieved. Beyond the regular regimental structure existed specialized formations developed for the unique requirements of defending a world permanently at war. The Caserkin represented the elite of the elite, soldiers selected from already exceptional shock troop veterans and subjected to additional training comparable to that received by stormtroopers of the Militarum Tempestus. Equipped with carapace armor and hellguns, deployed for only the most critical operations, Caskin developed distinct tactical doctrines, emphasizing decisive application of overwhelming force at crucial junctures. Their arrival at a threatened sector often reversed seemingly hopeless situations through perfect execution of lightning strikes against enemy command elements or critical vulnerabilities. The Cadian Interior Guard constituted another specialized formation, though one that received less glory than the Caskin. These soldiers maintained vigilance over the world's vast wilderness regions, particularly the areas surrounding the ancient pylons. Their duties required different aptitudes than frontline troops. Patience, observational acuity, and isolation tolerance proved more valuable than aggression or direct combat skills. The Interior Guard developed their own traditions and practices, including distinctive ceremonies performed at pylon sites that existed in the gray area between sanctioned imperial faith and technical heresy. Ecclesiarchy and commissariat authorities tacitly permitted these rituals after statistical analysis confirmed their apparent effectiveness in stabilizing pylon function during periods of heightened warp activity. Most specialized of all were the Lore Masters of Cadia, a secretive order of scholar soldiers tasked with preserving the accumulated tactical and strategic wisdom of 10 millennia. These individuals, selected for eidetic memory and analytical capabilities, underwent neural augmentation supervised by Mechanicus adepts to enhance their cognitive capacity. Each lore master memorized thousands of battle scenarios, defense configurations, and enemy attack patterns, serving as living strategic databases that could be consulted when communication with central command facilities became impossible. Distributed throughout Cadian forces, lore masters ensured that even isolated units could access the full depth of historical military knowledge, adapting ancient solutions to immediate tactical problems. The religious practices that evolved on Cadia reflected the world's unique circumstances and requirements. While the imperial creed formed the theological foundation, its expression took distinctive forms shaped by the constant proximity to the Eye of Terror and the endless war this proximity necessitated. Cadian faith emphasized the emperor's aspects as protector and warrior over more contemplative interpretations found elsewhere in the Imperium. Devotional practices integrated seamlessly with military training, prayer beads doubling as ammunition counters, devotional hymns paced for marching cadence, meditation exercises that enhanced combat focus. Cathedral fortresses dominated the spiritual landscape of major castles, their architecture as militarized as any bunker complex. Defense guns nestled among Gothic spires, observation posts occupied bell towers, and congregational spaces doubled as emergency triage centers during attacks. Within these structures, Cadian-born priests delivered sermons that differed subtly but significantly from standard ecclesiarchy teachings, emphasizing continuous vigilance as the highest form of devotion and presenting martyrdom not as glorious sacrifice but as pragmatic necessity. This martial faith generated distinctive sacred texts over the millennia. The Canticles of Defiance compiled prayers specifically composed during moments of crisis, their words believed to carry special potency against warp entities due to the circumstances of their creation. The litanies of the Sentinel contained responsorial recitations used to maintain unit cohesion during reality distortion events, their rhythmic patterns designed to anchor consciousness in material reality when the warp threatened. Perceptual integrity. The Book of Martyrs catalogued not only the names of the fallen but tactical analyses of their final actions, transforming remembrance into practical instruction for future defenders. Unique among imperial worlds, Cadia developed sanctioned incorporations of the ancient pylons into religious observance. Annual ceremonies conducted at major pylon sites included rituals where specially trained priests used modified sensors to disperse sacred unguents onto the blackstone surfaces, a practice that Mechanicus measurements suggested might marginally enhance the pylon's reality-stabilizing functions through mechanisms not fully understood. Whether this effect resulted from actual interaction between the chemicals and the pylons, or from some psychic resonance generated by the concentrated faith of participants remained unresolved, but pragmatic Cadian authorities permitted the practice based on empirical results rather than theoretical understanding. The constant proximity to the immaterium inevitably influenced Cadian psychology in ways that extended beyond military conditioning. The violet skies, perpetually illuminated by the baleful light of the eye, affected circadian rhythms and dream patterns. Cadian sleep cycles adapted to this constant twilight, with most citizens developing the ability to achieve rapid, deep rest in short intervals rather than extended periods of unconsciousness that might leave them vulnerable. Dreams took distinctive forms documented by Scholastica Psychana researchers. Collective archetypes emerged that appeared to reflect the psychic pressure exerted by the eye, processed through the filter of human subconscious. Within this environment of perpetual stress and constant vigilance, Cadian social structures evolved unique characteristics that prioritized stability and functionality. Family units maintained military-style hierarchies with clear chains of command extending from household patriarchs or matriarchs down to the youngest children. Marriages were often arranged based on genetic compatibility assessments and psychological complementarity rather than emotional attachment, though strong bonds typically developed through shared purpose and hardship. Reproduction was considered a strategic imperative rather than personal choice, with childbearing incentivized through additional resource allocations and status recognition. The concept of childhood, as understood on other imperial worlds, barely existed on Cadia. From their earliest years, Cadian children participated in defense drills, carried personal weapons scaled to their size, and practiced evacuation protocols until these actions became instinctive. Education seamlessly integrated practical combat skills with general knowledge, mathematics taught through ballistic calculation exercises, language skills developed through memorization of tactical communications protocols, history presented exclusively through the lens of military engagements. By the time they entered the White Shields, Cadian adolescents had already accumulated more combat training than many Imperial Guard veterans from other worlds would receive in their entire careers. This totality of militarization produced a society unlike any other in the Imperium, a culture where the distinction between civilian and soldier existed only as a technical classification rather than a meaningful difference in capability or mindset. Every Cadian, regardless of primary occupation, maintained combat readiness and expected to take up arms when necessary. Manufactorum workers practiced quick response deployments between production shifts. Medicaid personnel conducted triage exercises using actual casualties from training incidents. Even artistic expression took militarized forms, with music composed to maintain optimal marching pace and visual arts focusing on tactically accurate representations of historical battles. The psychological toll of this existence might have broken a less conditioned population. Indeed, Imperial observers from other worlds often questioned how Cadians maintained sanity under such relentless pressure. The answer lay partly in the genetic and cultural adaptations accumulated over millennia, but also in specialized coping mechanisms integrated into Cadian society. Ritual combat sports provided controlled release for aggressive impulses. Communal gatherings reinforced social bonds through shared experiences of symbolic resistance. Faith offered metaphysical context that transformed endless struggle from pointless suffering into sacred purpose. Yet beneath these adaptations, the fundamental weight of destiny pressed upon every Cadian soul. To be born on this world was to inherit a burden beyond comprehension to citizens of safer realms. The knowledge that one's existence served primarily as a temporary barrier between ravenous horror and the wider Imperium. This knowledge created a distinctive philosophical outlook, neither fatalistic nor optimistic, but possessed of a stern clarity about purpose and limitation. Cadians did not expect to prevail against chaos in any final sense. They expected only to hold it at bay for another day, another year, another generation. In this limited expectation, they found a form of freedom unknown to those who labored under illusions of permanent victory. As the 41st millennium progressed toward its conclusion, this burden grew heavier. Subtle changes in the Eye of Terror, detectable only to the specialized instruments of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the attuned senses of veteran interior guard patrols, suggested increasing instability in the barrier between material and immaterial realms. The ancient pylons exhibited fluctuations outside historical parameters, their energy signatures displaying harmonic distortions that concerned the most experienced analysts. Warp-sensitive individuals reported increasing pressure against their psychic defenses, as though something vast and patient on the other side had begun to lean more heavily against the thinning veil of reality. The Cadian High Command, comprised of officers whose combined experience spanned thousands of years of defensive warfare, recognized these signs from historical precedent. Previous Black Crusades had been preceded by similar phenomena, though never with the intensity or persistence now observed. Strategic assessments were revised, defense allocations increased, reserve formations activated from civilian sectors. The Departamento Munitorum, responding to formal requests endorsed by multiple Lord Castellans across successive administrations, authorized reinforcement beyond standard garrison levels, diverting regiments from other war zones despite competing strategic demands. Yet even as these preparations intensified, a subtle fatalism permeated Cadian leadership discussions. The mathematical projections were clear to those with sufficient clearance to access them. The trend, lines of pylon deterioration, warp pressure increase, and available defensive resources intersected at a point that suggested not if, but when Cadia would face a challenge beyond its capacity to withstand. This knowledge was carefully contained within the highest echelons, withheld even from many senior officers to prevent its corrosive effect on morale. The common soldiers and civilians continued their eternal vigilance, unaware that the burden they had borne for 10 millennia might be approaching a culmination point. In the face of this unacknowledged doom, the iron souls of Cadia neither faltered nor flinched. Regiments maintained discipline standards that would have seemed fanatical on any other world. Training cycles continued their relentless progression from white shield to veteran. Defense batteries conducted firing drills with mechanical precision. The interior guard patrolled their lonely circuits around the ancient pylons, reporting anomalies with professional detachment, regardless of their ominous implications. The machinery of resistance, human and material, continued its operation with the implacable momentum of 10,000 years of purpose. What gave these iron souls their most remarkable quality was not their strength but their clarity. Unlike the frenzied devotion of flagellant cults or the blind obedience of mind-scrubbed thralls, Cadian resolve emerged from unflinching recognition of reality. They harbored no illusions about their circumstances or prospects. They indulged no fantasies of divine intervention or final victory. They simply did what duty required for as long as duty required it, finding in this stark simplicity a kind of transcendence unavailable to those who clouded their understanding with hope or despair. In this clarity lay the true defense of Cadia, not in its walls or weapons, but in its people's refusal to surrender to either comforting delusion or paralyzing fatalism. The psychological fortification achieved through 10 millennia of evolutionary pressure, cultural conditioning, and practical experience had created something unprecedented in human history. A population that could stare into the literal face of hell without blinking, not because they were unafraid, but because they had mastered fear so completely it no longer influenced their actions. This mastery would face its ultimate test when Abaddon the Despoiler launched his 13th Black Crusade against the world that had defied his previous 12 attempts. The iron souls forged through 10,000 years of vigilance would be tested against malice accumulated over an equal span of hatred. The question that would determine the fate not merely of Cadia, but potentially of the Imperium itself, was whether iron, no matter how perfectly tempered, could withstand the full fury of the warp unleashed without limitation or restraint. The answer waited in the future, but the preparation for that answer lay in every aspect of Cadian existence, in every child trained to field strip a lasgun before learning to write, in every prayer recited in the shadow of ancient pylons, in every scar earned defending walls that had been rebuilt dozens of times across the millennia. Whatever came from the Eye of Terror, it would face not merely soldiers but the distilled essence of human defiance, crystallized through generations of sacrifice into something that transcended flesh, even while remaining bound to it. For in the final analysis, what stood between the Imperium and annihilation was not Cadia the planet, but Cadia the idea, the belief that duty persists beyond reason, beyond hope, beyond even the expectation of victory. That belief, encoded in the genetic and cultural legacy of a world that existed only to defend, would outlast any physical structure. It would remain when walls crumbled and pylons failed, when cities burned and oceans boiled away to vapor. It would persist in the hearts of survivors, even if no stone remained upon stone. Iron souls of Cadia would endure, even if Cadia itself did not. The weight of history burns deeper than fire. In the vast ledgers of imperial remembrance, few entries span so many blood-soaked millennia as the chronicle of defiance etched by Cadia against the tide of chaos. 12 times before its final hour, this fortress world faced the concentrated malice of the warp made manifest in the Black Crusades of Abaddon the Despoiler. 12 times, the Imperium trembled as the veil between reality and nightmare thinned. 12 times, Cadia stood bloodied but unbroken, though each victory exacted a price measured in millions of souls and vast tracts of sacred ground surrendered to ash. The First Black Crusade erupted from the Eye of Terror in 781, M31, barely 7 centuries after the Emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne. Imperial historians record this as the moment when Abaddon truly claimed the mantle of War Master, successor to the arch-traitor Horus, whose failure he had sworn never to repeat. The Despoiler emerged not merely to raid or pillage, but with strategic purpose to test the defenses established during the reorganization of Imperial forces following the heresy. Cadia, still developing its distinctive martial culture, faced a foe whose hatred had fermented across centuries of exile. The Imperial Navy flotillas stationed at the Cadian Gate, intercepted the Chaos fleet as it translated from the warp, but they had never faced an armada of such scale. Battle barges that had once proudly borne the colors of loyal legions, now advanced, corrupted, and befouled, their hulls twisted into forms that offended the eye and violated the physical laws that bound material vessels. Planetary defense monitors recorded the destruction of 17 capital ships in the opening hours, their death screams transmitted across all Vox channels, as though the enemy took particular pleasure in ensuring Cadia witnessed their demise. When Chaos forces made planetfall, they confronted fortifications still under construction. The Great Khazars existed then only as foundational outlines, their eventual majesty merely architectural ambition inscribed on parchment. What the first Cadians lacked in infrastructure, however, they compensated for with the desperate courage of those who understand they are the final line. Militarum regiments established during the Great Crusade, veterans of the heresy now aged but undiminished in resolve, stood alongside the first generation of true Cadians, those born beneath the violet skies and raised from birth for this moment. The despoiler himself did not set foot upon Cadia during this first testing, but his chosen lieutenants brought messages scribed in massacred populations and blasphemous symbols burned into the landscape visible from orbit. Entire settlements disappeared, their inhabitants transmuted into fleshy monuments to chaos, or simply atomized to deny the Imperium their service. The first battle of Casa Partox established the pattern that would repeat across millennia: heroic last stands, tactical withdrawals, counterattacks launched from concealed positions, and the grinding attrition that characterized Cadian warfare. When the First Black Crusade finally receded like a poisonous tide, it left behind a changed world. The surviving Cadians looked upon their devastated home and understood with perfect clarity what their existence would entail. Imperial relief forces discovered a population already rebuilding, not with lamentation but with grim efficiency. Casualty reports were analyzed for tactical insights. Defensive weaknesses were catalogued with ruthless objectivity. The dead were honored not with monuments, but with improved fortifications raised upon the ground sanctified by their sacrifice. Generations passed. The memory of the First Black Crusade transformed from personal trauma to historical record to foundational myth. The Cadians rebuilt and expanded, their culture crystallizing around the expectation of inevitable return. Training regimens incorporated lessons purchased with ancestral blood. Urban planning evolved to address vulnerabilities exploited by the first invasion. The Adeptus Mechanicus, recognizing Cadia's critical importance, established permanent installations to study the Blackstone pylons and enhance the world's technological defenses. The Second Black Crusade fell upon the sector in 597, M32, striking not directly at Cadia but at surrounding systems, a strategic adjustment that Imperial analysts interpreted as respect for the defenses developed since the initial assault. Nevertheless, Cadia stood ready as supporting worlds burned. Battlefleet Cadia engaged traitor vessels across multiple subsectors, while Cadian regiments deployed to neighboring planets demonstrated the effectiveness of their specialized training against warp entities. The network of monitoring stations established in the intervening centuries provided early warning that saved billions of lives, though billions more were lost in systems where evacuation proved impossible. When Chaos forces finally turned their attention to Cadia itself, they encountered a world transformed. Where makeshift bulwarks had stood during the first invasion, now rose the fully realized Khazars with their layered defenses and interlocking fire solutions. The first Khazkin squads, elite troops whose training regimens had been developed through centuries of refinement, demonstrated their devastating effectiveness against even demons of significant power. Orbital defense platforms, their gun batteries blessed by tech priests and consecrated in the blood of volunteers, created killing fields in the void that extracted ruinous tolls from approaching vessels. Again, Abaddon withheld his direct presence, though survivors reported manifestations of his image above battlefields, towering apparitions visible even to the non-psychically sensitive. their laughter penetrating even sound-dampening equipment. Whether these constituted actual warp projections or psychologically focused mass hallucinations remained disputed in classified Ordo Malleus assessments. Their effect on morale, however, was documented with empirical precision in after-action performance metrics. The Third Black Crusade in M32 targeted the ancient Adeptus Mechanicus fortress world of Hydra Caudatus, suggesting a strategic evolution in Abaddon's approach. While Cadia prepared for direct assault, the primary thrust fell elsewhere, a pattern that would repeat across subsequent crusades, forcing the Imperium to divide its defensive resources across multiple sectors. Nevertheless, Cadia faced substantial attack from splinter fleets and sacrificial forces. These engagements, though secondary to the despoiler's main objective, still exceeded in scale and intensity the most severe conflicts on many war-torn worlds. With each crusade, a pattern emerged. Abaddon probed Imperial defenses with increasing sophistication, testing responses, cataloging weaknesses, sacrificing resources to extract strategic intelligence. What appeared to some Imperial strategists as defeat or retreat revealed itself, across millennia of analysis, as methodical preparation, each crusade laying groundwork for those that would follow, each apparent failure containing seeds of future advantage. The despoiler, unlike so many servants of chaos, displayed patience spanning thousands of years, his hatred of the Imperium no less intense for being precisely controlled and directed. The Fourth Black Crusade in M34, remembered in Imperial chronicles as the Elfanor War, demonstrated this evolving strategy. While the Chaos Fleet struck at the Elfanor system, drawing significant Imperial reinforcements from the Cadian sector, a specialized force of traitor Astartes infiltrated Cadian orbital facilities. Utilizing technology and sorcery that defeated standard detection protocols, these agents sabotaged defensive systems and corrupted navigational beacons before being discovered. The damage required decades to fully repair, during which period Cadia remained vulnerable to follow-up attacks that, curiously, never materialized, suggesting the operation served intelligence gathering rather than immediate tactical purposes. The Fifth Black Crusade brought the Blood Angels chapter into Cadia's defense tapestry, when Abaddon's forces laid siege to the Morcanium hierarchies in 723, M36, the sons of Sanguinius responded with characteristic fury. Their intervention prevented a flanking maneuver that Imperial projections suggest would have compromised Cadia's southern continental defense grid. Statues commemorating this alliance adorned the processional avenue of Casa Myrak until its destruction, the crimson-armored figures standing in stark contrast to the olive drab of the Cadian regiments arrayed beside them. The Sixth Crusade in M36 revealed Abaddon's willingness to incorporate Xenos elements into his strategy when Eldar corsairs were observed fighting alongside traitor forces in void engagements near the Cadian Gate. Whether these represented actual alliances or merely opportunistic coordination remained unclear, but the development forced Cadian naval doctrine to adapt to the combined threat. Tactical officers incorporated Eldar attack patterns into simulation training, while Mechanicus adepts modified Auspex arrays to better detect the Xenobreed's notoriously elusive vessels. When similar coordination appeared in the Seventh Crusade, Cadian forces demonstrated markedly improved countermeasures. The Eighth and Ninth Black Crusades, unfolding within decades of each other in the early M37, suggested acceleration in Abaddon's timetable that proved ultimately misleading. Both campaigns featured feints toward Cadia, while primary forces struck elsewhere at the Ivory Portal during the Eighth Crusade and at Anticanus during the Ninth. Cadian leadership by this period evolved into an institution of unparalleled strategic sophistication, recognized the diversionary nature of the threats but could not ethically reduce defensive posture while millions of lives remained at risk. The resource drain these crusades imposed on the Imperium, forcing simultaneous defense of multiple sectors, revealed masterful strategic understanding that belied the common Imperial perception of Chaos forces as merely berserkers. By the time of the 10th Black Crusade in 001, M39, launched from the Eye of Terror on what ancient Terran calendars designated the first day of the first year of the Millennium. Cadian culture had internalized its eternal conflict to a degree difficult for outsiders to comprehend. Children born on Cadia learned of Abaddon alongside lessons about the Emperor, the despoiler's name incorporated into catechisms of hatred recited by infants still mastering language, his image standardized through intelligence reports into an iconic representation of ultimate evil adorned targeting dummies in training facilities. His tactical patterns formed the basis of strategic education in Cadian military academies, dissected with the same dispassionate analysis another world might apply to natural disasters or economic cycles. The 10th Crusade itself targeted the Helica sector, again drawing defensive resources from Cadia while subjecting the fortress world to secondary attacks. By this period, Cadian void defenses had evolved to incorporate automated response platforms capable of engaging chaos vessels without human direction, a technological innovation that proved crucial as warp anomalies during this crusade disrupted communication networks. When contact was restored after 37 days of isolation, Imperial relief forces discovered Cadia bloodied but unbowed, its defense grids operational, and its population grimly efficient in damage control operations. The 11th Black Crusade in M41 marked a return to direct assault on the Cadian Gate, with unprecedented concentration of traitor legion forces, supported by tangent analogs, so corrupted by warp influence that Mechanicus taxonomists created new classification categories to document their configurations. For the first time, Cadian climate control systems proved inadequate to manage atmospheric conditions, as warp-contaminated particulates generated toxic precipitation across the northern continent. Regiments fought in environmental sealed gear through burning rain that corroded both equipment and flesh, while Mechanicus containment teams struggled to prevent permanent biosphere degradation. Through these 11 crusades, spanning nearly 10,000 years of intermittent apocalypse, Cadian identity crystallized around the concept of endurance. Not victory, for how could one truly defeat the eternal malice of the warp, but the stubborn refusal to yield regardless of cost. Every aspect of Cadian culture reflected this essential truth. Architecture emphasized resilience over aesthetics, designed to remain functional even when heavily damaged. Agriculture focused on hardy crops that could survive in contaminated soil, and accelerated growing cycles that maximized yield between destruction events. Even interpersonal relationships operated according to pragmatic protocols that prioritized collective survival over individual attachment, with marriage contracts including detailed contingency clauses for partial or complete incapacitation of partners. Yet beneath this pragmatism pulsed something approaching mysticism, a faith not merely in the Emperor but in Cadia itself, as concept and reality. Cadia stands evolved from tactical status report to spiritual affirmation, incorporated into prayer cycles and inscribed above doorways. The planet's continued existence despite millennia of assault by mankind's greatest enemy became proof of divine favor, tangible evidence that the Emperor's will manifested through Cadian sacrifice. This belief sustained the population through trials that would have broken less conditioned peoples, providing metaphysical context for suffering that might otherwise have seemed pointless. No single figure embodied this spirit more completely than Lady Castellan Maricia Arden, who commanded Cadian forces during the 8th and 9th Black Crusades. Her tactical innovations, particularly the doctrine of void interdiction zones that transformed Cadian naval defense, saved countless lives and established principles still taught in Schola Progenium facilities throughout the Imperium. More significant than her strategic contributions, however, was the philosophical framework she articulated in her widely distributed Addresses to the Interior Guard, a series of contemplations on the nature of eternal vigilance that transformed pragmatic necessity into spiritual discipline. "We stand at the threshold where humanity ends," she wrote in what became known as the Seventh Address, not merely in physical space, though that truth is self-evident, but in metaphysical terms. Beyond us lies that which negates all human meaning, the dissolution of order, the corruption of purpose, the perversion of form. Our vigilance is not merely strategic but ontological. We guard not just the physical realm but the very concept of humanity itself. In this understanding, we transcend mere soldiery and become something for which the Gothic language lacks precise terminology. We are the boundary itself, made flesh. Such philosophical depth might seem incongruous in a military commander, but it characterized the unique Cadian perspective developed through millennia of sustained contact with chaos forces. Unlike Imperial citizens elsewhere, who might live entire lives without direct exposure to warp entities, Cadians existed in perpetual proximity to manifestations of mankind's greatest existential threat. This forced a sophisticated understanding of chaos not as abstract, a theological concept, but as practical reality requiring continuous management. The philosophical machinery to process this understanding developed alongside the military machinery to combat its physical manifestations. The vast memorial complexes that rose across Cadia between Black Crusades testified to this distinctive worldview. Unlike imperial monuments elsewhere, which typically emphasized individual heroism or momentous victories, Cadian memorials documented process rather than outcome, the maintenance of vigilance across generations despite inevitable losses. The Hall of Names in Cas-ur-Jark contained not statues of great leaders, but meticulously inscribed lists of every confirmed casualty across 9 millennia, their names rendered in microscopically small text that covered walls stretching for kilometers. Visitors described the experience of standing within this space as simultaneously humbling and fortifying, the visual manifestation of sacrifice too vast for comprehension, yet undertaken by individuals no different from themselves. What these memorials could not record, could not even acknowledge in many cases, were the subtler costs exacted by 10 millennia of vigilance. The classified archives of the Ordo Malleus documented concerning patterns across generations of Cadian psychological assessment. Prolonged proximity to both the Eye of Terror and the Blackstone pylons produced cognitive effects difficult to disentangle from cultural conditioning. Inquisitorial investigators catalogued increased incidents of shared dreamscapes among unrelated individuals, elevated rates of precognitive episodes classified as statistically significant but tactically unreliable, and persistent reports of visual phenomena at the periphery of perception, particularly in regions of high pylon concentration. Whether these phenomena represented actual warp contamination, adaptive evolutionary response to warp proximity, or psychological manifestations of sustained existential stress remained fiercely debated within Ordo conclaves. What could not be disputed was the measurable impact on Cadian military effectiveness. Units demonstrated uncanny coordination that sometimes exceeded what could be explained by training and communication protocols. Individual soldiers occasionally displayed situational awareness that anticipated enemy movements with accuracy exceeding probability models. When tested by embedded inquisitorial psychers using standardized protocols, Cadian populations consistently registered below the threshold for warp sensitivity while simultaneously exhibiting behavioral patterns suggestive of low-level psychic linkage. These anomalies attracted particular attention from the Ordo Chronos, whose interest in temporal distortion phenomena brought them into collaboration with the Ordo Malleus at several points during the millennia between Black Crusades. Their classified studies suggested localized chronological instability in regions surrounding daces, major pylons, with measurable discontinuities between time as experienced by observers in these areas versus baseline imperial chronology. Though never conclusively proven, some inquisitorial theorists proposed that the pylons themselves generated limited temporal isolation, creating a form of stasis field that partially separated Cadia from the normal flow of time, potentially explaining how the world sustained its defiance across timeframes that should have seen multiple cycles of civilizational collapse. Such esoteric concerns remained largely academic to the population who lived and died in Cadia's defense. For them, the rhythm of existence followed more immediate patterns: training cycles, patrol rotations, maintenance schedules, defensive drills. The intervals between Black Crusades, regardless of their chronological measurement, presented not respite but opportunity for preparation. Each generation inherited the accumulated knowledge of their predecessors, encoded in training, protocols and tactical doctrines refined through battle testing against the worst horrors the warp could manifest. This knowledge found physical expression in the evolution of Cadian military equipment. The distinctive Hellgun patterns developed by Cadian Mechanicus enclaves incorporated modifications specifically effective against demonic entities, their power cells calibrated to frequencies that disrupted warp-sustained anatomies. Defensive position templates evolved to incorporate hexagrammic ward configurations that Ordo Malleus testing confirmed provided measurable protection against certain categories of warp manifestation. Even the famous Cadian pattern lasgun, standard issue for shock troops across millennia, underwent subtle modifications after each Black Crusade, its design representing not static standard but evolving response to accumulated combat data. The 12th Black Crusade, known in Imperial records as the Gothic War, unfolded across the Gothic sector between 139 M. 41 and 160 M. 41. While it did not directly target the Cadian Gate, this campaign revealed Abaddon's interest in Blackstone, the same mysterious material from which the pylons on Cadia were constructed. Imperial analysts, correlating data across thousands of years of chaos activity, identified a pattern previously obscured by the vast timeframes involved. The despoiler's movements across multiple crusades, when mapped across both physical space and chronological sequence, suggested methodical investigation of Blackstone deposits throughout the segmentum. This realization triggered increased Mechanicus and inquisitorial attention to the pylons that had stood on Cadia since before human settlement. Research teams attempting to access the deeper structures of major pylon complexes reported equipment failures and inexplicable personnel losses, suggesting defense mechanisms beyond current Imperial understanding. The pylons, previously regarded as convenient strategic assets, revealed themselves as objectives of potentially critical importance to both sides of the eternal conflict, their true nature and purpose, a mystery whose solution might determine the ultimate fate of Cadia and perhaps the Imperium itself. As the 41st millennium progressed toward its final centuries, subtle changes manifested in the pattern of chaos activity around the Cadian Gate. Augur arrays detected increased ship movements within the Eye of Terror, while long-range surveillance indicated unprecedented resource accumulation at staging points just beyond Imperial monitoring capability. Astropathic communications reported rising background interference levels across all channels, the psychic static characteristic of large-scale warp activity. Mechanicus monitoring stations documented energy fluctuations in the Blackstone pylons exceeding historical parameters. The consistency of these anomalies eliminating ordinary statistical variation as explanation. These indicators, individually concerning but collectively alarming, prompted reassessment of Cadian defensive posture across all levels of Imperial authority. The Administratum authorized resource allocation exceeding standard protocols, prioritizing Cadian supply requisitions above competing claims from other war zones. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica reinforced the Cadian Astropathic Choir, with senior adepts transferred from Terra itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus dispatched specialized research teams including Archmagos-grade personnel normally restricted to Mars and other Forge worlds of highest classification. These preparations, conducted with methodical thoroughness, reflected the institutional memory of an Imperium that had witnessed 12 previous Black Crusades and recognized the portents of a 13th. For the population of Cadia, these developments registered not as abstract strategic concerns but as lived reality. They observed the increased activity at orbital docks, the arrival of reinforcement regiments from distant systems, the intensified training rotations, and equipment inspections. They felt the subtle vibration through Cadia's crust as ancient machineries deep beneath the surface activated in response to automated alert protocols. They noted the increased presence of non-Cadian personnel. Inquisitorial agents moving with poor attempts at discretion, Mechanicus specialists escorted to pylon sites under heavy guard, officers from Segmentum Command requiring familiarization with local defense systems. Most significantly, they recognized in these preparations the fulfillment of purpose for which their entire civilization had been designed. Across 12 previous Black Crusades, across 10,000 years of vigilance, Cadia had stood as the Imperium's shield against the concentrated malice of the Warp. Now, as evidence mounted that the 13th and perhaps final confrontation approached, the inheritors of this burden neither faltered nor complained. They simply continued their preparations with the machine-like efficiency and human resolve that characterized their kind, each individual understanding their place in a defense mechanism spanning generations. Cadian historical archives, maintained with characteristic thoroughness despite periodic destruction and reconstruction, preserved fragmentary records from each previous Black Crusade. These documents, studied as religious texts by officer candidates and tactical analysts alike, revealed a consistency in Abaddon's approach despite surface variations in target and technique. The despoiler accumulated knowledge with each campaign, his strategy evolving in response to Imperial adaptation. He sacrificed resources to extract intelligence, withdrew forces to preserve capabilities for future deployment, and maintained focus on long-term objectives across timeframes that rendered most human planning irrelevant. This longitudinal perspective allowed Cadian analysts to discern patterns invisible to observers with shorter historical horizons. The despoiler's campaigns, when viewed across millennia rather than individual conflicts, revealed not separate crusades but a single extended operation conducted across multiple phases. Each apparent defeat contained seeds of future advantage. Each withdrawal preserved critical resources while leaving Imperial infrastructure damaged. Each probe extracted information about defense capabilities that informed subsequent attack vectors. This understanding transformed the historical narrative from repeated Imperial victories into a single prolonged engagement whose conclusion remained undetermined. As the final century of the 41st millennium advanced, those with access to the most sensitive intelligence recognized with growing clarity that all previous Black Crusades had been preparatory. The true objective remained unclear: the destruction of Cadia itself, the deactivation or corruption of the pylons, or some outcome not yet conceived by Imperial strategists. What could not be disputed was the methodical patience with which Abaddon had pursued this objective across a time frame that rendered most human planning meaningless. 10,000 years of preparation suggested a goal whose significance justified such investment. For the Cadian population, such strategic abstractions held less importance than immediate practical concerns. They focused on what they could control: training rotations, equipment maintenance, fortification reinforcement, evacuation drills. The rhythm of their existence continued unchanged despite the gathering storm, their discipline neither diminishing from fatigue nor intensifying from panic. They had stood sentinel for 10 millennia. They would continue standing for as long as duty required, neither expecting final victory nor accepting ultimate defeat. In the violet shadows beneath Cadia's perpetual twilight, as preparations for the 13th confrontation intensified, the memorial flames burned without interruption. These eternal flames, maintained since the First Black Crusade, symbolized both remembrance of sacrifice and continuation of purpose. Their light illuminated the names of the fallen inscribed on surrounding walls, not merely honored ancestors but tactical instructors whose experience, encoded in after-action reports and training doctrines, continued to guide their descendants. The dead of Cadia never truly departed but remained present in the practices they established, the lessons they purchased with blood, the defensive improvements erected upon ground they consecrated with sacrifice. 12 times defiant, Cadia prepared to face its 13th trial. The weight of history pressed upon its defenders not as burden but as foundation, the accumulated knowledge and resolve of countless generations who had stood where they now stood, facing the same eternal enemy with the same unyielding determination. Whether the 13th confrontation would follow historical precedent or represent unprecedented escalation remained to be seen. What could not be doubted was that Cadia would stand as it had always stood, the final bulwark between humanity and the hungry darkness that eternally sought its dissolution. The violet skies above Cassar Craf darkened with unnatural storms as the 999th year of the 41st millennium drew toward its close. Augur arrays detected increasing warp turbulence around the Cadian Gate, while astropathic communications reported rising interference consistent with large-scale fleet movements within the Eye of Terror. Long-range monitoring stations went silent with increasing frequency, their final transmissions containing fragmentary data suggesting observation before destruction. The ancient pylons thrummed with energy fluctuations that caused geometric patterns to appear briefly on their obsidian surfaces before fading back into impenetrable blackness. In the command bunkers deep beneath Cadia's largest cassars, officers reviewed historical records of the 12 previous Black Crusades with renewed intensity, searching for patterns that might predict the form of the 13th. The Adeptus Mechanicus research teams conducted increasingly desperate investigations of the pylons, attempting to unlock secrets preserved for millennia within their crystalline matrices. The ecclesiarchy led mass prayer cycles in the great cathedral fortresses, the sound of millions chanting in unison rising above even the mechanical cacophony of defensive preparations. On the parade grounds where countless generations of Cadians had trained before facing the horrors of the warp, a new generation of white shields received their final inspection before deployment to defensive positions. Their faces, still bearing traces of childhood beneath the rigid discipline of their expressions, revealed the same determination that had characterized their ancestors across 10 millennia of resistance. They would stand as Cadians had always stood, neither expecting victory nor accepting defeat, simply executing their duty for as long as breath remained in their bodies. 12 times Abaddon had broken himself against the rock of Cadia. 12 times the fortress world had endured despite wounds that would have destroyed any other planet. The 13th confrontation approached not as possibility but certainty, the culmination of a conflict spanning longer than most human civilizations had existed. Whatever the outcome, this engagement would write the final chapter in a chronicle of defiance, unprecedented in Imperial history, a testament to human determination, standing against the literal manifestation of mankind's darkest impulses. Cadia had defied the despoiler 12 times before. It prepared to defy him once more, unaware that this 13th defiance would unfold differently from all that had preceded it. The Blackstone pylons, repositories of ancient technologies and purposes beyond Imperial understanding, held secrets that would transform what might have been merely another devastating assault into something far more final. But that knowledge remained mercifully concealed from those who prepared for the storm, allowing them to face the coming apocalypse with the same unwavering resolve that had sustained their ancestors through 10 millennia of endless war. The end began with silence. In the final days of 999, M41, astropathic communications throughout the Cadian sector faltered and died, not with the screaming dissolution characteristic of warp storms, but with a gradual diminishment, as though something vast and patient simply absorbed the psychic energies upon which Imperial messaging relied. Monitoring stations recorded the phenomenon spreading outward from the Eye of Terror in concentric patterns, each perfectly geometrical, in a manner that suggested deliberate design rather than natural occurrence. Within this expanding sphere of psychic nullity, Cadia found itself increasingly isolated from the Imperium it had defended for 10 millennia. Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed, Supreme Commander of Cadian military forces and veteran of 100 campaigns, recognized the strategic implications immediately. Standing in the strategium of Cassar Craf, surrounded by data slates displaying the progressive communications failure, he issued orders with the mechanical precision that had made him legendary among Imperial commanders. Fleet elements were repositioned to maintain physical courier chains. Emergency protocols dormant for centuries activated automatically. Ancient communication systems, maintained through ritual rather than practical expectation of use, were extracted from sealed vaults and prepared for deployment. The preparations unfolded with the choreographed efficiency unique to Cadian military operations. Mechanicus engineers calibrated long-range Auspex arrays to detect translational energy signatures characteristic of large fleet movements. Defense platforms adjusted firing solutions to compensate for anticipated communication lags. Shock troop regiments rotated from reserve to forward deployment according to predetermined schedules, each unit commander understanding their role within the larger defensive structure without requiring explicit instruction. Civilian populations initiated phased tertius evacuation preparations, not from fear, but from disciplined adherence to protocols established millennia before their birth. Above this machinery of preparation, the skies of Cadia manifested increasing disturbance. The perpetual auroras that illuminated the atmosphere with violet radiance intensified and shifted toward deeper purple hues tinged with crimson undertones. Mechanicus instruments recorded harmonic frequencies in these manifestations corresponding to mathematical patterns associated with heightened warp activity. More concerning were the voices reported by those who stood watch along the planet's defensive perimeters, whispered phrases in languages never intended for human articulation, carrying emotional resonances that induced physiological responses even in those without psychic sensitivity. The inquisitorial presence on Cadia, always substantial given the world's strategic importance, expanded dramatically as representatives from multiple ordos arrived to observe and assess. Their black ships slipped into orbit with minimal communication, disgorging personnel who moved through Cadian fortress cities with purpose unconcealed by their attempts at discretion. Veteran Cadians recognized the pattern from historical records. The Imperium's most secretive organization, deploying its resources not merely to observe, but to contain whatever might soon emerge from the Eye of Terror. On the 9th day of silence, the first refugees arrived. Imperial vessels of varying classifications and conditions translated into real space at the edge of the Cadian system, their hulls bearing evidence of desperate flight. Intercepted by Battlefleet Cadia picket ships, these vessels reported the same phenomena, silence spreading across neighboring systems, followed by manifestations visible even to the non-psychically sensitive, culminating in massive warp translations that disgorged chaos vessels by the hundreds. The descriptions, conveyed through mechanical vox rather than unreliable astropathic means, carried the unmistakable cadence of apocalypse barely survived. Lord Castellan Creed, reviewing these reports in the underground strategium complex beneath Casa Kraf, recognized the strategic pattern from historical precedent. The blackstone pylons that dotted Cadia's surface had always provided a stabilizing effect on the surrounding region, limiting the scale of warp manifestation and constraining the ability of chaos forces to translate directly into near-Cadian space. This protection created a funnel effect that forced attacking forces to approach through predictable vectors, allowing the formidable defenses of the Cadian Gate to exact maximum attrition. The current pattern of activity suggested this fundamental advantage might be compromised. On the 12th day of silence, reinforcements began arriving from neighboring sectors. The Adeptus Astartes, recognizing the existential threat posed by a successful breach of the Cadian Gate, deployed forces from multiple chapters to bolster the world's defenses. Drop pods streaked through the violet skies, delivering space marines in the colors of the Dark Angels, Imperial Fists, Black Templars, and numerous other chapters whose heraldry stirred recognition even among the notoriously stoic Cadians. These transhuman warriors took position at critical defensive junctures, their presence providing both tactical advantage and psychological reassurance to troops who understood what their arrival signified. The Adeptus Mechanicus similarly reinforced their presence, though with less visible deployment and more esoteric purpose. Specialized research vessels established orbit around major pylon clusters, while tech priest contingents conducted increasingly intensive analysis of the ancient structures. Their arcane instruments detected fluctuations in the pylon's energy emissions exceeding historical parameters, variations that correlated with the expanding sphere of astropathic silence and suggested some form of interference with the pylon's fundamental functions. The implications of these findings remained restricted to the highest clearance levels, though the increased activity around pylon sites communicated significance even without explicit confirmation. From the Adeptus Ministorum came not reinforcements but intensification of existing presence. The cardinal fortresses of Cadia, those massive cathedral complexes designed as much for defense as worship, became centers of continuous prayer cycles conducted on rotation to ensure uninterrupted supplication. The sound of millions chanting in perfect unison carried across blast-scarred landscapes, providing soundtrack to the martial preparations unfolding beneath. Whether these devotions influenced events through metaphysical means or merely strengthened morale remained theologically disputed, but pragmatically irrelevant in the face of chaos. Faith constituted practical defense as surely as lasguns and artillery. Imperial Titan legions diverted from conflicts across multiple sectors arrived to reinforce crucial defensive positions. These god machines, towering over even the massive walls of Cadian castles, took position at strategic choke points where their unprecedented firepower could be applied with maximum effect. The psychological impact of their presence extended beyond mere tactical advantage to Imperial defenders. They embodied the Omnissiah's protection made manifest. To attacking forces, they represented obstacles requiring resource expenditure disproportionate to any potential gain. Their machine spirits, ancient and temperamental, seemed to respond to the increasing warp disturbance with heightened aggression, their reactor cores thrumming at elevated output even during standby protocols. On the 18th day of silence, the first direct attack materialized, not from the expected vectors monitored by Battlefleet Cadia, but from within the planet itself. In 17 locations simultaneously, reality ruptured as warp portals manifested in precisely calculated positions, each outside major population centers, but within critical infrastructure nexuses. From these tiers in the material universe poured chaos forces bearing the unmistakable iconography of the Black Legion, their movements suggesting not frenzied assault, but methodical execution of predetermined operational objectives. The simultaneity and precision of these deployments indicated planning and patience, wholly at odds with the common Imperial understanding of chaos forces as fundamentally undisciplined. The Cadian response unfolded with equal precision. Defense plans, contemplating this specific scenario, developed through historical analysis of previous Black Crusades and regularly updated through training simulations, activated automatically upon confirmation of incursion parameters. Cascan strike teams deployed via Valkyrie carriers precisely 7 minutes after initial manifestation, their assault patterns designed to disrupt enemy consolidation before defensive positions could be established. Artillery batteries pre-registered on likely materialization coordinates initiated fire missions within operational parameters. Despite the unprecedented nature of multiple simultaneous manifestations across disparate geographic regions. For 37 hours, combat raged across these 17 infection points. The concentrated hatred of the Black Legion, harbored across 10 millennia of exile, confronted the distilled discipline of Cadian defenders, shaped by an equal span of vigilance. Neither side fought with the desperation of those surprised by circumstance. This confrontation had been anticipated by both across time frames that rendered individual lives insignificant within the broader strategic context. The Chaos forces fought with cold purpose rather than berserker frenzy, suggesting direction from intelligence that understood Cadian defensive doctrine and had developed specific countermeasures. When the engagement concluded, Imperial forces had contained 16 of the 17 incursion points. The final breach, located in an isolated region controlled by the Interior Guard, expanded despite concentrated artillery bombardment and repeated Valkyrie strikes. Subsequent analysis indicated this location overlay a minor pylon nexus not identified in standard Mechanicus survey records, suggesting targeting based on intelligence unavailable to Imperial defense planners. By the time Space Marine reinforcements arrived from Kasser Kraf, the Chaos forces had established a fortified perimeter, and begun some form of operation upon the pylon structure itself, an operation interrupted but not prevented by the eventual Imperial containment. This initial assault proved merely prelude. On the 24th day of silence, the true assault began. Reality tore open across the void surrounding Cadia as the largest Chaos fleet recorded in Imperial history translated from the warp in a single, synchronized materialization. Vessels of every classification filled the tactical displays of Battlefleet Cadia's flagship, their configurations defying standard recognition protocols as warp exposure had twisted their forms beyond mechanical categorization. At their center moved ships of such scale that dedicated monitoring arrays focused exclusively on their energy signatures, the output exceeding parameters established for even the most massive Gloriana-class vessels recorded in historical archives. Lord Admiral Quarren, commanding Battlefleet Cadia through a distinguished career spanning centuries of void warfare, recognized immediately that conventional engagement presented no possibility of victory. The defensive formations established during the preceding weeks of preparation allowed for controlled withdrawal to secondary positions, extracting maximum attrition while preserving core battle groups for subsequent counterattack. This strategy, executed with precision characteristic of Imperial Navy operations in the Cadian theater, transformed what might have been immediate annihilation into protracted void war that would extend across the following weeks, buying precious time for ground-based defenses to complete final preparations. The opening void engagement presented a spectacle of destruction, unprecedented even in a region accustomed to apocalyptic warfare. Lance batteries capable of vaporizing conventional vessels expended their energy against void shields layered to degrees suggesting technological heresy. Macro-cannon shells the size of hab blocks traversed the vacuum between opposing formations, their mass-reactive payloads detonating in synchronized patterns designed to overwhelm specific defense sections through concentrated force application. Torpedo spreads containing warheads blessed by both tech priests and ecclesiarchy officials traced luminous trajectories through the debris-choked void, seeking vulnerable points in the twisted anatomies of Chaos vessels. Despite the tactical excellence of Imperial naval forces and the substantial defensive advantages provided by permanent installations throughout the Cadian system, the mathematical reality of engagement proved inescapable. The Chaos fleet outnumbered Battlefleet Cadia by a factor exceeding 4-1, with individual vessel capabilities suggesting qualitative advantages in addition to quantitative superiority. Under these circumstances, the controlled withdrawal executed by Lord Admiral Quarren represented not failure but optimization, extracting maximum strategic value from inevitable tactical defeat, preserving capabilities for subsequent application at more advantageous junctures. As Imperial naval forces withdrew to secondary defense positions, Chaos vessels established orbit around Cadia itself and began landing operations of unprecedented scale. Drop pods and assault boats descended through the violet skies in such numbers that atmospheric entry created visible distortion patterns observable from the surface. Defensive batteries engaged these incoming threats according to predetermined priority hierarchies, concentrating fire on vessels whose energy signatures suggested command and control functions or specialized threat capabilities. The effectiveness of this defensive fire, though significant in absolute terms, proved inadequate against the sheer volume of incoming hostiles. The ground war that followed unfolded across geographic scales difficult to comprehend even for a world accustomed to massive military operations. The first wave targeted outlying Cassa's Drac, Jark, and Tyrok in simultaneous assaults that suggested coordination implausible for forces supposedly driven by the anarchic impulses of chaos. Defensive forces had anticipated this approach based on analysis of previous Black Crusades, but the precision of execution and tactical sophistication demonstrated by the attacking forces exceeded historical precedent. Particularly concerning were the specialized units deployed against specific defensive capabilities, suggesting intelligence gathering beyond what should have been possible given Cadian security protocols. Cassa Drac fell within 27 hours of initial assault, its population executing predetermined evacuation protocols that preserved approximately 63% of defenders while denying critical resources to attacking forces through self-destruct sequences activated upon confirmation of containment failure. Cadia held for 72 hours before systematic targeting of void shield generators created vulnerabilities that forced similar withdrawal. Cadia, benefiting from terrain features that channeled attacking forces into predetermined kill zones, continued resistance beyond initial projections but reported resource depletion rates, indicating inevitable containment failure within the following operational cycle. These losses, while significant in absolute terms, aligned with strategic projections incorporated into overall defense planning. Cadian military doctrine, refined across millennia of practical experience, recognized the impossibility of preserving all assets against concentrated assault of sufficient scale. The operational objective focused instead on controlled attrition, extracting maximum cost from attacking forces while preserving core defensive capabilities for subsequent concentration at decisive points. This doctrine, executed with the mechanical precision characteristic of Cadian military operations, transformed apparent defeat into component elements of a broader strategic approach, not immediately visible to attacking forces. Throughout these initial engagements, the warp manifestations accompanying Chaos forces demonstrated concerning evolution beyond patterns observed in previous Black Crusades. Reality distortions extended beyond immediate proximity to daemonic entities, creating persistent areas where physical laws operated with reduced reliability. Gravitational anomalies affected ballistic calculations, temporal inconsistencies disrupted coordination of combined arms operations, and spontaneous materialization of warp matter contaminated previously secure areas without direct exposure to enemy forces. These phenomena suggested some fundamental change in the relationship between material and immaterial realms within the Cadian theater, a change that corresponded with observed fluctuations in the Blackstone pylons monitored by increasingly concerned Mechanicus adepts. The psychological warfare accompanying the physical assault demonstrated similar sophistication. Vox channels across all standard Imperial frequencies carried transmissions consisting not of coherent communication but precisely modulated sound patterns that induced specific neurological responses in unprotected listeners. Cadians, conditioned through lifelong exposure to chaos influence, demonstrated greater resistance than reinforcement troops from other Imperial worlds, necessitating triage protocols that prioritized psychological stabilization for non-Cadian personnel. Even with these countermeasures, cases of acute stress reaction increased by factors exceeding 200% compared to baseline combat operations, straining Medicaid resources already taxed by physical casualties. On the 33rd day after the initial silence, a new element entered the conflict. Massive energy signatures appeared at the edge of the Cadian system, their profile matching no known Imperial or Xenos vessel classification, but registering in Mechanicus archives sealed millennia. The Blackstone fortresses, ancient weapons of non-human origin, whose full capabilities remained theoretical rather than demonstrated, had awakened from dormancy. Historical records connected these structures to Abaddon's 12th Black Crusade, the Gothic War, during which the despoiler had captured several fortresses and demonstrated partial activation of their offensive capabilities. Their appearance in the Cadian theater suggested escalation beyond conventional parameters, introduction of strategic assets reserved for decisive application. Within the strategium deep beneath Cadia Craft, Lord Castellan Creed assessed these developments with the dispassionate clarity that had elevated him to supreme command. The tactical situation presented unambiguous deterioration across all fronts, with resource depletion curves intersecting projected chaos offensive capability at points indicating eventual system failure regardless of defensive optimization. This assessment, shared with the command staff assembled around the hololithic display table, met neither despair nor denial, but the stoic acceptance characteristic of Cadian leadership acknowledgement of reality as prerequisite to effective response rather than cause for emotional reaction. The strategic adjustments that followed demonstrated why Imperial military theorists ranked Creed among the greatest commanders in human history. Defensive resources previously distributed according to standard doctrinal parameters concentrated instead around key pylon clusters, prioritizing those whose energy signatures showed strongest correlation with stability of the Cadian gate. Mechanicus research teams received military escorts disproportionate to their apparent tactical significance, while specialized Tempestus Scion units deployed to locations seemingly peripheral to primary engagement zones. These movements, inexplicable to observers lacking strategic context, represented application of insight accumulated through exhaustive analysis of historical patterns across all 12 previous Black Crusades. As these adjustments unfolded, a new presence manifested on the primary front. Survivors from Casa Tyrok, retreating through predetermined evacuation corridors towards secondary defensive positions, reported phenomenal light, visible even through the smoke and ash of continuous bombardment. This radiance, golden in hue rather than the sickly purples and greens characteristic of warp manifestations, spread outward from a single point of origin near the shattered East Gate. From this light emerged a figure whose appearance transported even the most hardened veterans to the devotional imagery of their childhood instruction. A woman in armor of ancient design, wings of pure light extending from her back, wielding a sword that burned with cleansing fire. Saint Celestine, the bride of the Emperor reborn through means beyond mortal comprehension, had joined the defense of Cadia. Imperial historical records documented previous manifestations of this entity during moments of extreme peril, though the metaphysical mechanisms enabling such intervention remained theologically disputed. Whatever the theoretical explanation, the practical impact proved immediately measurable. Troops in proximity to the living saint demonstrated performance metrics exceeding baseline capabilities by factors of 300 to 500%, while warp entities exhibited behavior patterns consistent with extreme aversion, withdrawing from her presence even against apparent tactical advantage. The saint's arrival coincided with similar reinforcement of more material nature. The Fourth Company of the Black Templars chapter, responding to astropathic distress calls transmitted before the silence descended, translated into the Cadian system and deployed directly to critical defensive junctures. Their Thunderhawk gunships cut through contested airspace with typical Astartes' disregard for conventional tactical doctrine, delivering concentrated transhuman combat power precisely where it could achieve maximum impact. The psychological effect of their arrival, particularly in conjunction with Saint Celestine's manifestation, temporarily reversed the deteriorating morale situation among frontline Imperial defenders. These developments, while tactically significant, represented merely localized adjustments to a strategic situation whose fundamental parameters remained unchanged. The Chaos Offensive continued its methodical progression, demonstrating coordination and purpose entirely at odds with the stereotypical understanding of warp-derived forces as inherently undisciplined. Particularly concerning was the pattern of attacks targeting Blackstone pylons, not as collateral damage from broader offensive operations, but as primary objectives pursued with focused determination. This prioritization, observed across multiple engagement zones, suggested strategic understanding that aligned with Mechanicus' concerns regarding the pylon's role in stabilizing the Cadian gate. On the 41st day of conflict, the pace of engagement accelerated dramatically. Chaos forces previously engaged in methodical advance shifted to maximum intensity assault across all fronts simultaneously, abandoning position security and resource conservation in favor of overwhelming pressure against all defensive positions. This transition, while superficially resembling the frenzied attacks commonly associated with Chaos forces, demonstrated underlying strategic purpose, saturation of Imperial defensive capabilities beyond sustainable response thresholds, creating breakthrough opportunities through sheer volume of simultaneous threats rather than concentration against specific vulnerabilities. Imperial forces, already stretched beyond doctrinal parameters by the preceding weeks of continuous engagement, found themselves confronting attackers who no longer valued self-preservation or position consolidation. Chaos troops advanced directly into prepared fire lanes without attempting evasive maneuvers, absorbing catastrophic casualties while maintaining offensive momentum through sheer numerical superiority. Vehicles charged defensive emplacements without infantry support, sacrificing survivability for immediate shock effect. Aircraft executed attack profiles that guaranteed destruction after weapons release, prioritizing delivery of payloads over pilot and airframe preservation. Against this tide of nihilistic aggression, even Cadian discipline proved increasingly inadequate. Defensive positions constructed and maintained across centuries of preparation found themselves overwhelmed, not through tactical sophistication, but through arithmetic inevitability, when attackers consider 500 casualties acceptable. Cost for eliminating a single defensive position, conventional force ratio calculations lose practical meaning. The casseurs previously considered impregnable enacted contingency protocols developed for scenarios classified as theoretically possible but practically unlikely, their populations withdrawing to hardened core zones, while automated defense systems maintained maximum attrition against advancing forces. As this desperate situation unfolded across Cadia's surface, a new development materialized in the void above. Auger arrays registered massive energy displacement at the system's edge, indicating void translation of unprecedented scale. Imperial defenders, anticipating further chaos reinforcement, prepared for additional deterioration of an already critical situation. The reality proved both unexpected and transformative. An Imperial fleet of significant scale had finally broken through the warp disturbances surrounding the Cadian system, its composition indicating assembly from multiple battle fleet elements across neighboring sectors. This relief force, while substantial under normal operational parameters, represented merely qualified improvement given the established Chaos naval superiority. More significant was the vessel at the fleet's center, instantly recognizable to Imperial naval personnel through its distinctive silhouette, the Phalanx, ancient flagship of the Imperial Fists chapter and one of the largest vessels in Imperial service. Its arrival represented not merely tactical reinforcement, but strategic recalibration, introducing capabilities beyond conventional naval assets and signaling Astarte's commitment at chapter rather than company scale. The void battle that followed demonstrated both the valor and ultimate limitations of Imperial naval doctrine when confronted with chaos forces of sufficient scale. The relief fleet executed textbook attack patterns, concentrating fire to create breakthrough corridors through which supply vessels might reach Cadia's surface with critically needed resources. The Chaos Armada, while temporarily disrupted by this unexpected development, quickly adjusted to the new, tactical situation, using their numerical advantage to maintain effective containment while selectively engaging high-value Imperial assets. The resulting conflict unfolded across three-dimensional space in patterns so complex that even augmented cogitators struggled to maintain comprehensive tactical displays. Beneath this massive void engagement, the ground war reached its critical inflection point. After 47 days of continuous assault, Casa Kraf, the primary command center for Cadian defense operations and location of Lord Castellan Creed's headquarters, faced imminent containment failure. Its outer defensive rings had been systematically eliminated through concentrated application of force. Its void shield generators operated at unsustainable capacity levels, and its ammunition reserves approached critical depletion thresholds. The civilian population had been evacuated through underground transit networks to secondary locations, leaving only military personnel and essential support staff to continue resistance beyond rational expectation of success. It was at this moment of apparent defeat that Abaddon himself finally materialized on the field of battle, not through conventional deployment from orbit, but through direct warp manifestation at a location precisely 17 kilometers from Casa Kraf's primary command bunker. The energy discharge accompanying this translation registered on monitoring equipment throughout the region, temporarily overloading sensitive detection systems and creating electromagnetic disruption that affected Vox communications across multiple channels. Witnesses described atmospheric effects visible even through the perpetual smoke of artillery bombardment, a vertical column of darkness that appeared to absorb rather than block light, extending from ground to low orbit in direct contravention of physical law. From this impossible darkness emerged the despoiler, his physical form embodying 10 millennia of concentrated hatred. Standing twice the height of an unaugmented space marine, clad in ancient Terminator armor whose surfaces bore inscriptions in languages never intended for human comprehension, wielding the daemon sword Drachnien, whose edge seemed to cut reality itself, Abaddon represented the antithesis of everything Cadia had stood for across its long vigil. His presence on the battlefield transformed the conflict from military engagement into symbolic confrontation between diametrically opposed forces. The concentrated malice of chaos against the distilled discipline of humanity's defenders. The effect of Abaddon's arrival extended beyond symbolic significance. Chaos forces throughout the region exhibited immediate behavioral changes, transitioning from already intense assault patterns to near-suicidal aggression focused exclusively on creating breakthroughs rather than holding territory. Warp manifestations increased by orders of magnitude, reality distortions expanding beyond localized anomalies into interconnected fields that covered significant portions of the engagement zone. Most concerning were the energy fluctuations detected at nearby pylon sites, where monitoring equipment recorded harmonic disruptions, suggesting fundamental interference with the ancient structure's operational parameters. Within the strategium of Kasser Kraf, Lord Castellan Creed assessed these developments with the same analytical precision he had applied throughout the campaign. The tactical implications of Abaddon's personal intervention, the strategic purpose behind his manifestation at this specific location and juncture, the correlation between his arrival and the observed pylon disruptions, these factors combined to indicate purpose beyond conventional military objectives. The despoiler had not committed his physical presence merely to oversee a planetary assault, regardless of Cadia's symbolic importance. Something more fundamental drove his actions, something connected to the Blackstone pylons whose true nature and purpose remained incompletely understood even after millennia of study. As Creed formulated response strategies based on this analysis, reports arrived from orbit, indicating new development with potentially existential implications. The Blackstone fortresses, previously maintaining position at the system's edge, had begun coordinated movement toward Cadia itself. Their energy signatures, already beyond conventional classification parameters, showed increasing intensity that corresponded with accelerating pylon disruption across the planet's surface. Mechanicus adepts monitoring these phenomena reported correlation coefficients exceeding 0.97, indicating near-perfect synchronization between the approaching fortresses and the planet-side structures. Despite no visible connection between them, the planet killer had arrived. This vessel, ancient and terrible beyond conventional understanding, had participated in multiple previous Black Crusades. Its world-destroying capabilities, demonstrated against lesser targets, but never fully unleashed against a fortress world of Cadia's significance. Its presence in the approaching formation, flanked by the Blackstone fortresses, whose energy emissions showed harmonic relationship with its own output, suggested application of strategic assets reserved for objectives of highest priority. The implications could not be misinterpreted by any observer with access to historical context. Abaddon intended not merely to defeat Cadia but to obliterate it entirely, removing the physical obstacle that had defied him across 10 millennia of hatred. This revelation, transmitted through secure channels to command assets throughout the Cadian defense network, transformed the operational parameters from conventional defense to existential preservation. All remaining resources concentrated toward a single objective: prevention of whatever mechanism Abaddon intended to employ against the Blackstone pylons. The details remained unclear, but the correlation between the despoiler's physical presence, the approach of the planet killer and Blackstone fortresses, and the increasing disruption of pylon energy patterns indicated a coordinated operation with clearly defined purpose. That purpose, whatever its specific mechanisms, represented threat not merely to Cadia, but potentially to the fundamental stability of the Cadian Gate itself. In the violet skies above Casa Kraf, as warp-tainted clouds parted beneath weapons fire of apocalyptic scale, the silhouette of the planet killer became visible to ground observers. Its form defied conventional naval architecture, resembling less a vessel than a mobile weapons platform constructed around a central moor of impossible scale. As it established synchronous orbit directly above the region where Abaddon had manifested, energy discharges visible even to unaugmented human vision began to play between its superstructure elements, building toward activation threshold with methodical progression that suggested ritual as much as mechanical process. The final confrontation between Cadia and its ancient nemesis had begun. Not merely a military engagement between opposing forces, but a fundamental clash between contradictory realities, the ordered discipline of humanity against the entropic malice of chaos. Whatever the outcome, this battle would write the final chapter in a chronicle spanning 10 millennia of defiance. The despoiler had descended personally to oversee Cadia's destruction, bringing with him weapons capable of erasing worlds from existence. Against this apocalyptic threat stood the inheritors of the longest vigil in human history, their determination undimmed by the prospect of annihilation. In the command bunker of Casa Kraf, surrounded by tactical displays showing situation deterioration beyond recovery parameters, Lord Castellan Creed issued his final orders with the same mechanical precision that had characterized his leadership throughout the campaign. The defense of Cadia would continue, regardless of mathematical probability, extracting maximum cost from the enemy until the final defender fell. This was not optimism but obligation, the fulfillment of purpose that had defined Cadian existence across 10,000 years of preparation for this precise moment. The light of Saint Celestine shone against the darkness descending from orbit, while the guns of Casa Kraf roared defiance against arithmetic certainty. Cadia, the fortress that had stood sentinel at the gates of hell for longer than most human civilizations had existed, prepared to make its final stand against the concentrated hatred of the being who had sworn its destruction. The fate not merely of a single world, but potentially of the Imperium itself hung in the balance as the despoiler's descent reached its culmination. The 49th day of the siege marked the transition from desperate defense to inevitable collapse. Throughout the Cadian heartlands, where once proud Cassars had dominated disciplined landscapes, only 3 major strongholds remained operational: Casa Kraf, Casa Gallan, and Casa Sonnen. Between them stretched territories contested with such ferocity that geographical features disappeared beneath the churning devastation of continuous bombardment. Topographical surveys conducted by Mechanicus Observation Craft registered elevation changes exceeding 20 meters in regions subjected to concentrated artillery deployment, while atmospheric contamination reached levels that would have triggered immediate evacuation protocols under any circumstances other than apocalyptic war. Within the command bunker of Casa Kraf, where Lord Castellan Creed maintained strategic oversight despite 17 confirmed assassination attempts by Chaos infiltration teams, the hololithic display revealed a defensive situation deteriorating beyond conventional stabilization parameters. Void shield generators, operated at 217% of rated capacity, their machine spirits sustained beyond mechanical limits through constant ministration by tech priest cohorts who had abandoned orthodox doctrine in favor of desperate improvisation. Ammunition reserves for primary defensive batteries had fallen below 30% of minimum operational requirements, forcing fire control officers to implement extreme conservation protocols that prioritized targets by threat calculus rather than maintaining suppression saturation. Most concerning were the reports from specialized Mechanicus monitoring teams deployed at pylon sites throughout the remaining Imperial-controlled territories. The ancient structures, whose true purpose and operation had remained incompletely understood despite millennia of study, exhibited energy signatures indicating fundamental destabilization. harmonic frequencies that had maintained consistent patterns across thousands of years of observation now fluctuated with increasing amplitude, while spectroscopic analysis detected molecular-level changes in the blackstone material itself. These changes correlated precisely with the energy emissions from the blackstone fortresses, maintaining synchronous orbit above a relationship that suggested deliberate interference rather than coincidental disruption. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The pylons had always been understood, if incompletely, as stabilizing influences on the barrier between real space and the warp. Their deterioration manifested in observable phenomena across the remaining Imperial-held territories. Vox communications suffered from increasing interference that electronic countermeasures proved inadequate to filter. Chronometric devices displayed discrepancies between readings taken at different locations, the temporal inconsistencies expanding beyond measurement error into genuine time dilation effects. Most alarmingly, troops stationed near failing pylons reported perceptual distortions that Commissariat psychological officers classified as potential prelude to warp contamination. Against this backdrop of physical and metaphysical deterioration, Imperial resistance continued with mechanical determination characteristic of Cadian military doctrine. The defense of Casa Kraf exemplified this relentless efficiency despite circumstances that should have rendered organized resistance impossible. Every street and building had been prepared for defense in depth, according to templates refined across thousands of years of urban warfare experience. Strategically expendable structures were pre-rigged with demolition charges calibrated to create optimal rubble patterns for channeling enemy advance into prepared kill zones. Water and promethium distribution systems had been modified to enable flash flooding or incineration of specified grid sectors with minimal notice. The human element matched this physical preparation in disciplined resolve. Cadian shock troops maintained formation cohesion despite casualty rates that would have shattered units from any other world, their conditioning so thorough that even mortally wounded soldiers continued to execute fire discipline protocols until biological function ceased. Kuskin elite units deployed precisely at critical junctures where tactical modeling predicted imminent breakthrough, their concentrated firepower temporarily reversing situation deterioration through application of overwhelming force against specific vulnerabilities. Even civilian support personnel, those deemed essential for continued military operations, demonstrated combat effectiveness exceeding baseline metrics for dedicated troops from less militarized worlds. This resistance extracted punishing cost from attacking forces, but mathematics remained implacable. The Chaos Offensive continued its relentless pressure across all fronts simultaneously, absorbing catastrophic casualties with apparent indifference to conventional force preservation principles. Cultists advanced into certain death by the tens of thousands, their bodies creating macabre ramps over defensive barriers that subsequent waves utilized for position improvement. Daemon engines, their impossible anatomies violating physical laws as openly as their weapons violated flesh, concentrated against void shield generators with single-minded purpose that suggested unified strategic direction rather than chaotic impulse. Traitor Astartes, their ancient armor bearing the desecrated iconography of legions that had turned from the Emperor's light 10 millennia earlier, provided tactical expertise that transformed what might have been merely overwhelming assault into precisely calculated application of force against identified weaknesses. On the 50th day, as tactical projections indicated defense failure within 72 hours under current attrition rates, the nature of the conflict transformed. The change began not with conventional military development, but with a manifestation that defied rational categorization. Above the central administrative complex of Casa Kraf, where the primary Vox relay coordinated communications across remaining Imperial forces, reality rippled like disturbed water. Witnesses describe the phenomenon in religious rather than physical terminology, a wound in the world that bled light rather than darkness, radiance that evoked forgotten memories of natural sunlight rather than the sickly illumination of the warp or the artificial glare of military lighting. From this impossible brightness emerged Saint Celestine in her full glory, no longer merely present on the battlefield, but fully manifest in power that transcended her previous interventions. The golden light that surrounded her expanded outward in concentric waves, touching Imperial defenders with warmth that medical officers later documented as producing measurable physiological effects. Accelerated wound healing, heightened cognitive function, increased pain tolerance. More significant were the psycho-spiritual consequences recorded by Ministorum observers embedded with frontline units. Troops exposed to the Saint's radiance demonstrated performance metrics exceeding maximum baseline by factors of 300 to 500%, while expressing subjective experience described consistently as the Emperor's direct presence, regardless of individual theological sophistication. The Saint's manifestation coincided with coordinated counteroffensive operations launched from all three remaining casas. Whether this timing represented strategic synchronization or divine intervention became theologically disputed in subsequent ecclesiarchy analysis, but the practical effect proved immediately apparent in tactical developments. Imperial forces that had maintained purely defensive posture for 7 weeks transitioned to aggressive advance along carefully selected vectors, concentrating overwhelming force against specific segments of the chaos containment perimeter. The Saint herself led the primary thrust from Casa Kraf, her radiance burning away warp entities that approached her position, while her flaming sword cleaved through corrupted armor and flesh with equal facility. This counteroffensive achieved breakthrough within 17 hours of initiation, creating a corridor between Casa Kraf and Casa Gallen that enabled resource reallocation between previously isolated defensive positions. Supply convoys protected by combined Astartes and Kaskan escorts transferred critical ammunition reserves and medical supplies, while wounded personnel moved in the opposite direction toward better-equipped Medicae facilities. Mechanicus technical teams utilized this temporary operational freedom to conduct essential maintenance on defensive systems pushed far beyond design specifications by weeks of continuous operation. The psychological impact extended beyond practical considerations, as the first offensive success after unrelenting defensive pressure provided tangible evidence that resistance remained meaningful rather than merely obligatory. The chaos response manifested on the 52nd day, when Abaddon himself entered the conflict directly rather than through proxies. His appearance on the battlefield, reported simultaneously by multiple observer teams positioned along the counteroffensive corridor, transformed the conflict from military engagement to symbolic confrontation. Standing twice the height of an unaugmented space marine, clad in archaic Terminator armor whose surfaces bore inscriptions that hurt the eyes of those who gazed upon them too long, wielding the daemon sword Drachnien with the casual proficiency of one who has mastered his weapon across millennia of continuous war, the despoiler embodied the concentrated malice of chaos, directed with cold precision rather than frenzied abandon. Where Abaddon walked, reality shuddered in sympathetic resonance with his presence. The ground beneath his feet blackened and cracked, not from applied heat but from fundamental rejection of physical laws. The air around him shimmered with distortion patterns that caused perceptual difficulties for observers beyond certain proximity thresholds. Most concerning were the effects documented by Mechanicus monitoring equipment deployed in concealed positions along his advance route energy signatures, indicating direct correspondence between the despoiler's movements and fluctuations in the already destabilized Blackstone pylons. Each step he took across Cadian soil registered as harmonic disruption in the ancient structures, suggesting purposeful interference rather than coincidental correlation. The immediate military consequences of Abaddon's direct intervention proved catastrophically effective for Chaos forces. The counter-offensive corridor, established through concentrated application of Imperial resources and sustained only through continuous commitment of reserve forces, collapsed within 8 hours of the despoiler's appearance on the battlefield. Units that had advanced with disciplined coordination found themselves suddenly isolated as supporting elements disintegrated under assault, characterized by observers as systematic dismantling rather than merely overwhelming. force. The casualties incurred during this collapse exceeded total losses from the preceding 72 hours of conventional engagement, depleting trained personnel reserves beyond replacement capability. Saint Celestine herself confronted Abaddon directly in the shattered remains of what had once been the primary transit nexus between Kasser Kraf and Kasser Gallen. The engagement, witnessed by few survivors and recorded only through fragmentary picked captures from damaged observation drones, unfolded not merely as combat between powerful individuals, but as symbolic representation of diametrically opposed cosmic principles. The Saint's golden radiance met the despoiler's reality-distorting aura in visible manifestation of metaphysical conflict, creating interference patterns that technical analysts later described as physicalized theological confrontation in classified reports submitted to the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus. The outcome remained tactically indecisive, as both combatants withdrew from direct engagement after exchange of blows that left portions of the battlefield permanently altered by their metaphysical consequences. The Saint returned to Imperial lines bearing wounds that leaked light rather than blood, while Abaddon redirected his attention toward objective parameters not immediately apparent to Imperial observers. This temporary cessation of direct confrontation provided breathing space for disorganized Imperial forces to reconsolidate defensive positions. Though the strategic situation continued its inexorable deterioration regardless of localized tactical adjustments. On the 53rd day, as the ragged remnants of the counter-offensive force struggled to re-establish defensive perimeters along their original positions, a new element entered the conflict. Augur arrays monitoring near-orbital space detected massive energy displacement consistent with void translation of substantial naval forces. Initial assessment indicated probability of chaos reinforcement exceeding 87% given observed patterns, but reality proved unexpectedly favorable to Imperial defenders. An Imperial relief fleet had finally penetrated the warp disturbances surrounding the Cadian system, bringing supplies and reinforcements that tactical projections had classified as beyond reasonable operational expectation. This relief force, while substantial under normal classification parameters, represented merely qualified improvement given the established Chaos naval superiority. More significant was the vessel at the fleet's center, instantly recognizable to Imperial naval personnel through its distinctive silhouette, the Phalanx, ancient flagship of the Imperial Fists chapter and one of the largest vessels in Imperial service. Its arrival represented not merely tactical reinforcement, but strategic recalibration, introducing capabilities beyond conventional naval assets and signaling Astarte's commitment at chapter rather than company scale. The void battle that followed demonstrated both the valor and ultimate limitations of Imperial naval doctrine when confronted with Chaos forces of sufficient scale. The relief fleet executed textbook attack patterns, concentrating fire to create breakthrough corridors through which supply vessels might reach Cadia's surface with critically needed resources. The Chaos Armada, while temporarily disrupted by this unexpected development, quickly adjusted to the new tactical situation, using their numerical advantage to maintain effective containment while selectively engaging high-value Imperial assets. The resulting conflict unfolded across three-dimensional space in patterns so complex that even augmented cogitators struggled to maintain comprehensive tactical displays. Despite these limitations, the relief fleet achieved its primary objective, creating temporary breach in the Chaos naval perimeter sufficient for deployment of specialized assets directly to remaining Imperial strongholds. Drop pods and Thunderhawk gunships descended through contested airspace, carrying reinforcements specifically configured for the tactical situation on Cadia's surface. These included not merely combat troops but technical specialists, Medicae personnel, and most critically, senior Mechanicus adepts with specialized knowledge regarding the Blackstone pylons, whose destabilization had become central to the broader strategic situation. Beneath the naval engagement unfolding in orbit, the ground war entered a new phase characterized by increasingly metaphysical dimensions. The Blackstone pylons, Those ancient structures whose true purpose had remained incompletely understood despite millennia of study now exhibited behavior that transcended conventional scientific categorization. Energy emissions fluctuated according to patterns that Mechanicus adepts identified as mathematically intelligible but physically impossible, suggesting operation according to principles outside established understanding of material universe functionality. More concerning were the visible manifestations accompanying these fluctuations. Geometric patterns appearing spontaneously on the blackstone surfaces, emitting light across spectral ranges, including wavelengths that should have been imperceptible to human vision, yet registered directly on observers' consciousness. The correlation between these phenomena and the wider deterioration in real space stability could not be misinterpreted by any observer with access to comprehensive monitoring data. Throughout remaining Imperial-controlled territories, reality itself demonstrated increasing fragility. Vox communications suffered from temporal displacement effects, with transmissions occasionally arriving before they were sent or containing information not included by their originators. Gravitational anomalies affected weapon trajectories in patterns that defied compensation algorithms, forcing firing solutions to incorporate intuitive adjustment rather than mathematical calculation. Most alarmingly, troops stationed in proximity to failing pylons reported perceptual distortions consistent with early-stage warp exposure, necessitating rotation protocols that limited individual exposure periods below contamination thresholds. Within this environment of physical and metaphysical deterioration, Imperial forces continued resistance with grim determination, characteristic of Cadian military tradition. The defense of Casa Kraf exemplified this stubborn efficiency, despite circumstances that should have rendered organized opposition impossible. Every street and building had been prepared for defense in depth, according to templates refined across thousands of years of urban warfare experience. Ammunition reserves, while critically depleted, were allocated according to optimization algorithms that prioritized maximum effect per expenditure rather than sustained suppression. Medical resources, stretched beyond design capacity by weeks of continuous casualty influx, maintained functionality through procedural adjustments that prioritized return to combat outcomes over complete recovery. Lord Castellan Creed orchestrated this defense from the primary command bunker beneath Casa Kraf's administrative complex, his tactical genius finding expression in deployment patterns that extracted maximum effectiveness from rapidly diminishing resources. Reinforcements arriving from orbit were distributed precisely to pressure points identified through predictive analysis of enemy behavior patterns, while reserve forces repositioned continuously to present unexpected resistance at junctures where attacking forces anticipated breakthrough. These adjustments, while insufficient to reverse the broader strategic deterioration, succeeded in extending resistance beyond mathematical probability, transforming what should have been immediate collapse into protracted defense that continued to extract punishing cost from attacking forces. On the 55th day, as tactical projections indicated defense failure within 48 hours under current attrition rates, the nature of the conflict transformed again. The change originated not from conventional military development, but from the Blackstone pylons themselves. Throughout remaining Imperial-controlled territories, the ancient structures simultaneously manifested energy signatures exceeding all previously recorded parameters. The harmonic frequencies that had maintained consistent patterns across thousands of years of observation now destabilized completely, while spectroscopic analysis detected molecular-level changes in the Blackstone material itself, progressing at accelerating rates. These changes corresponded precisely with movements observed among the Blackstone fortresses in orbit, suggesting coordinated operation toward shared objective. The practical consequences manifested immediately in observable reality distortion throughout the Cadian theater. Localized warp breaches opened spontaneously in apparently random patterns, disgorging entities that defied categorization according to established ordo-malleus taxonomic systems. Temporal anomalies expanded beyond measurement discrepancies into genuine chronological fracturing, with isolated pockets of space-time operating at different rates relative to surrounding environment. Gravitational fluctuations intensified to levels that affected not merely ballistic calculations but basic mobility, creating regions where normal human movement became impossible without specialized equipment or augmentation. Against this backdrop of fundamental reality failure, the defense of Casa Kraf entered its final phase. Void shield generators, sustained far beyond design specifications through continuous technical intervention, began catastrophic cascade failure as power systems could no longer maintain necessary output levels. Defensive perimeters, already contracted through sequential tactical withdrawals to conserve resources, fragmented into isolated strong points with limited coordination capacity as command and control networks degraded under combined electronic warfare and reality distortion effects. Ammunition reserves for primary weapon systems reached depletion levels that necessitated transition to melee-focused defense protocols, transforming disciplined fire patterns into desperate close-quarters resistance. Throughout this deterioration, the Mechanicus research teams deployed from the relief fleet concentrated their efforts on the pylons, rather than conventional military objectives. These specialists, selected for expertise in archaeotech analysis and warp interface systems, applied methodologies developed through study of similar structures identified during the Gothic War. Their objective, communicated to Lord Castellan Creed through secure channels isolated from standard command networks, focused not on preventing the pylon's deterioration, but on understanding the process sufficiently to potentially reverse or redirect it. This represented strategic pivot from conventional defense to metaphysical intervention, acknowledgement that the conflict had transcended military dimensions into cosmic confrontation. On the 57th day, as Casa Gallen fell to concentrated assault that overwhelmed its final defensive positions through sheer numeric superiority, the research teams reported preliminary findings of critical strategic significance. The Blackstone pylons were not merely failing, but being deliberately reprogrammed through application of technologies conceptually similar to those employed by the Blackstone fortresses. This reprogramming appeared designed to invert their fundamental function, transforming structures that had stabilized the barrier between real space and the warp into mechanisms that would actively destabilize it. The implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation on Cadia, potentially threatening the integrity of the barrier throughout the region designated as the Cadian Gate. Lord Castellan Creed, assessing these findings with the analytical precision that had characterized his leadership throughout the campaign, recognized the existential threat they represented not merely to Cadia but to the Imperium itself. The strategic objective shifted from conventional planetary defense to prevention of whatever mechanism Abaddon intended to employ against the pylons. All remaining resources concentrated toward this single purpose, with secondary considerations subordinated regardless of apparent tactical significance. This included evacuation protocols for personnel not directly engaged in operations against the despoiler's primary objective, though practical implementation faced severe limitations given the collapsed state of most transportation infrastructure. As these adjustments unfolded across remaining Imperial forces, Abaddon himself reappeared on the primary battlefield, accompanied by specialized chaos units bearing equipment of obvious archaeological origin. These artifacts, their design incorporating elements inconsistent with known technological lineages from either human or identified Xenos sources, appeared functionally related to the Blackstone material comprising the pylons. When activated in proximity to these structures, they generated energy fields that interfaced directly with the pylon's own emissions, creating synchronized patterns that accelerated the reprogramming process previously identified by Mechanicus research teams. The despoiler's personal oversight of this operation confirmed its critical importance within the broader strategic framework of the 13th Black Crusade. Imperial response concentrated all available assets against this newly identified critical threat. Space Marine strike forces deployed directly from orbit via drop pod insertion accepting catastrophic casualty rates during descent through contested airspace to deliver concentrated transhuman combat power precisely where it might disrupt the despoiler's operation. Remaining Kaskin units redirected from defensive positions, leaving those perimeters critically undermanned but prioritizing intervention against existential threat over tactical preservation. Artillery batteries expended precious remaining ammunition in saturation patterns designed to destroy the archaeological equipment even at cost of collateral damage to the pylons themselves. Recognition that damage stabilization represented preferable outcome to successful inversion. The engagement that followed unfolded across multiple dimensions simultaneously. In physical space, Chaos and Imperial forces clashed with apocalyptic intensity, focused around the archaeological equipment and the pylons they targeted. In metaphysical terms, reality itself became contested territory as the ancient structure's programming shifted under external influence, creating localized reality distortions that affected combatants on both sides without discrimination. Most significantly, the conflict acquired theological dimension as Saint Celestine reappeared, leading a contingent of battle sisters whose faith-based abilities demonstrated particular effectiveness against both warp entities and reality distortion. Effects. For 17 hours, this multi-dimensional battle raged without clear resolution. Imperial forces achieved temporary tactical successes, destroying several pieces of archaeological equipment and eliminating Chaos technical specialists operating them. The despoiler himself engaged directly when concentrated opposition threatened his primary objective, his personal combat effectiveness exceeding even theoretical projections developed by Ordo Malleus tactical analysts. The Saint confronted him repeatedly across the shattered landscape, their engagements creating visible manifestation of metaphysical conflict as golden radiance met reality-distorting darkness in direct opposition. Neither gained lasting advantage, though the surrounding environment suffered permanent alteration from exposure to their clashing auras. On the 60th day of the siege, as this desperate conflict approached its climax, the final element entered the equation. Augur arrays monitoring orbital space detected massive energy buildup within the Blackstone fortresses, maintaining position above the primary engagement zone. This activation corresponded precisely with accelerating fluctuations in the pylons below, suggesting coordinated preparation toward shared purpose that transcended conventional military objectives. The energy patterns matched no known weapon profile in Imperial databases, but historical records from the Gothic War provided sufficient context for preliminary assessment. The despoiler intended to employ the Blackstone fortress's primary weapon systems directly against Cadia itself. This assessment received confirmation when one of the fortresses, designated as Will of Eternity, in intercepted Chaos communications, maneuvered into optimal firing position relative to the primary pylon cluster. The energy accumulation within its structure reached levels that overwhelmed monitoring equipment designed for conventional weapons analysis, while specialized augur arrays detected reality distortion, extending outward from its position in expanding spherical pattern. These phenomena matched historical records from previous employment of Blackstone Fortress weapons capabilities against planetary targets, though the scale exceeded any documented precedent by orders of magnitude. The final moments of this phase unfolded with dreadful inevitability. Imperial naval forces, already engaged beyond sustainable operational parameters against superior Chaos fleet elements, concentrated all available firepower against the Will of Eternity in desperate attempt to prevent weapons discharge. This effort, while tactically sound given available information, proved insufficient against both the fortress's inherent defensive capabilities and the protective screen provided by supporting Chaos vessels. The Phalanx itself, ancient flagship of the Imperial Fists, executed attack run that demonstrated both the vessel's legendary capabilities and the ultimate limitations of even the most powerful Imperial naval assets when confronted with archaeotech of sufficient advancement. When the Will of Eternity finally discharged its primary weapon system, The effect transcended conventional categorization. The beam that connected fortress to planet appeared less as energy projection than as fundamental reality reconfiguration, a cylindrical volume within which the normal laws of physics simply ceased operation, replaced by principles inimical to material existence. Where this phenomenon intersected Cadia's surface, matter did not merely disintegrate, but transformed through processes that defied analysis by conventional scientific instrumentation. The impact point, precisely calculated to affect the primary pylon cluster where Abaddon's archaeological equipment had focused its influence, created not merely destruction but metaphysical wound in the planet itself. The blackstone pylons at the impact site, already destabilized through the despoiler's deliberate interference, shattered not merely physically but conceptually, their programming collapsing into paradoxical patterns that cascaded outward through the network, connecting all similar structures across Cadia's surface. This cascade effect, monitored by increasingly desperate Mechanicus research teams attempting remediation protocols beyond experimental parameters, demonstrated exponential acceleration as each pylon failure increased stress on those remaining. The mathematical projection became inescapable. Complete systemic collapse had become inevitable regardless of potential countermeasures. This reality became immediately apparent in observable phenomena throughout the Cadian theater. The violet skies, perpetually illuminated by the baleful light of the Eye of Terror, darkened to purple-black shot through with crimson veins resembling capillaries in wounded flesh. The ground itself shuddered in continuous seismic activity that sensors indicated originated not from conventional tectonic movement, but from fundamental instability in the planet's material composition. Most alarmingly, the barrier between real space and the warp, always thin in the region of the Cadian Gate, but maintained through the pylon's stabilizing influence, began systematic deterioration, visible even to non-specialized observers, as localized reality failures expanded across the landscape. Within the command bunker of Kasr Kraf, Lord Castellan Creed assessed these developments with the same analytical precision that had characterized his leadership throughout the campaign. The tactical situation had progressed beyond potential stabilization through conventional military response. The strategic objective could no longer focus on preservation of Cadia as physical entity, but must shift to mitigation of consequences resulting from its inevitable destruction. This assessment, shared with senior command staff through secure channels isolated from general communications networks, initiated the final phase of Imperial operations on the dying world, extraction of personnel and resources with potential value beyond the immediate conflict. The evacuation protocols activated in response to this directive faced implementation challenges beyond normal operational parameters. Transportation infrastructure throughout remaining Imperial-controlled territories had suffered catastrophic degradation through 60 days of continuous warfare, while available spacecraft for orbital extraction represented fraction of capacity required for complete personnel removal. These limitations necessitated triage procedures that prioritized specialized personnel, Mechanicus research teams with knowledge regarding the pylons, command staff with strategic intelligence value, specialized combat units with skill sets difficult to replace through standard training programs. The majority of Cadian military forces would necessarily remain on-world to continue resistance regardless of strategic futility, extracting maximum cost from the enemy until final planetary failure. Saint Celestine herself coordinated aspects of this extraction operation, her radiance providing both physical illumination and metaphysical stabilization in regions where reality deterioration had progressed beyond parameters compatible with normal human function. Under her guidance, transport vessels navigated through reality distortions that should have rendered conventional movement impossible, while evacuation columns traversed territories where the laws of physics operated with increasing unreliability. This intervention, while insufficient to alter the broader strategic outcome, enabled preservation of personnel and knowledge that would prove crucial in subsequent Imperial response to the consequences of Cadia's destruction. As these desperate operations unfolded across the dying world, Abaddon the Despoiler observed from the command deck of the Planet Killer, with the cold satisfaction of one who has pursued single objective across timeframe exceeding normal human comprehension. The destruction of Cadia represented not merely elimination of physical obstacle, but culmination of strategic plan extending across all 13 Black Crusades each previous campaign, laying groundwork for this final execution, regardless of apparent outcome. The pylons, whose destabilization now progressed toward inevitable conclusion, had always been his primary target. Their relationship to the stability of the barrier between real space and the warp, representing vulnerability that could, if properly exploited, transform not merely the Cadian Gate but the Imperium itself. On the 63rd day, as the planetary crust began systematic fragmentation along fault lines corresponding to the pattern of destabilized pylons, the final act of Cadian defiance unfolded. Lord Castellan Creed, having overseen evacuation operations to the extent possible given catastrophic limitations, issued directive that would enter Imperial historical records as exemplifying the spirit that had sustained this fortress world across 10 millennia of vigilance. The remaining military forces of Cadia, those for whom evacuation proved impossible given available transportation capacity, would continue resistance until final dissolution, regardless of strategic futility. This represented not irrational rejection of inevitable outcome, but fundamental expression of Cadian identity, the absolute refusal to yield regardless of circumstance that had defined this world since its founding. The order, transmitted through deteriorating communication networks to surviving command nodes throughout remaining Imperial-controlled territories, received acknowledgement with mechanical precision characteristic of Cadian military protocol. No objections were registered, no clarification requested, no emotional response indicated in official records. The inheritors of the longest vigil in human history accepted their final duty with the same disciplined resolve that had sustained their ancestors through 12 previous Black Crusades. They would stand until they could stand no more, extracting maximum cost from the enemy until the final defender fell or the world itself dissolved beneath their feet. In the violet darkness above Casa Kraf, as reality itself continued its inexorable fragmentation, the silhouette of the Planet Killer dominated the visible sky. Its form defied conventional naval architecture, resembling less a vessel than a mobile weapons platform constructed around a central moor of impossible scale. As it established synchronous orbit directly above the region where the Will of Eternity had delivered its devastating strike, energy discharges visible even to unaugmented human vision began to play between its superstructure elements, building toward activation threshold with methodical progression that suggested ritual as much as mechanical process. The final confrontation between Cadia and its ancient nemesis approached its inevitable conclusion. Not merely a military engagement between opposing forces, but a fundamental clash between contradictory realities, the ordered discipline of humanity against the entropic malice of chaos. The Despoiler had achieved the objective pursued across 10 millennia of hatred, breaking not merely a fortress world, but the gate it had protected. The pylons that had maintained stability in the barrier between real space and the warp collapsed in cascading failure, their destruction opening wound in reality itself that would transform the Imperium in ways yet unrealized but already unavoidable. Yet even in this moment of unprecedented defeat, something endured that transcended physical preservation. The spirit that had animated Cadian resistance across 10 millennia of vigilance, the absolute refusal to yield regardless of circumstance, the stubborn insistence on duty fulfilled without consideration of outcome remained unbroken, even as the world itself fractured beneath the feet of those who embodied it. This spirit would outlast the physical planet, carried forward by survivors scattered across the stars, becoming foundation for continued resistance in the dark era to follow. Cadia would fall, but in a sense deeper than mere geography or physical existence, Cadia would stand eternal. Death is merely duty's final form. On the 65th day, Cadia died, not as a civilization falling to conquest or a population extinguished by disaster, but as a physical entity torn apart by forces that transcended conventional destruction. The Blackstone pylons, Those ancient structures that had maintained reality's stability for millennia uncounted, failed in cascading sequence that spread across the planet like neural death, propagating through a dying brain. Each collapse increased stress on those remaining, creating exponential acceleration toward inevitable systemic failure. When the final pylon shattered, its crystalline matrix dissolving into component particles that themselves dissolved into nothingness, the last barrier between Cadia and oblivion collapsed with it. The planet's death throes manifested in phenomena beyond standard seismic categorization. The crust fractured along fault lines corresponding precisely to the pattern of fallen pylons, creating perfect geometric shapes that planetary tectonics should not have permitted. Magma escaped through these fractures not in volcanic eruptions but in mathematically regular fountains that rose to identical heights before collapsing in synchronized waves. The atmosphere itself began separating into visible layers, distinguished not by composition, but by the degree to which physical laws remained operational within each stratum. Gravity fluctuated according to patterns that Mechanicus instruments detected but could not predict, creating zones where objects fell upward or sideways, or not at all. Within this environment of fundamental physical breakdown, the evacuation of Cadia continued with desperate efficiency. The surviving spacecraft, their numbers already inadequate for complete population extraction under normal circumstances, faced operational challenges that transcended standard emergency parameters. Navigation systems calibrated for conventional three-dimensional space struggled to compute courses through regions where spatial dimensions themselves had become unreliable. Engines designed for normal gravitational conditions labored against fluctuating fields that alternately crushed vessels against the dying planet or threatened to fling them beyond controlled trajectory into the void. Even basic life support faced unprecedented stress as the atmosphere through which these craft ascended separated into layers with radically different compositions, some lacking elements necessary for mechanical or biological function. Despite these obstacles, Imperial evacuation operations continued with the mechanical determination characteristic of mankind's highest achievements. Naval personnel calculated manual course corrections where automated systems failed, adjusting thrust patterns through intuitive understanding where mathematical models collapsed under reality's dissolution. Medicae staff improvised atmospheric supplements when external composition shifted beyond survivable parameters, utilizing equipment never designed for such applications. Most significantly, navigators and astropaths whose psychic sensitivity should have rendered them incapacitated by the metaphysical turbulence maintained functional capacity through disciplined will alone, providing guidance where mechanical sensors detected only chaos. The human cost of this determination manifested in silent suffering rather than lamentation. Crews worked through injuries that would have hospitalized them under normal circumstances, their pain suppressed not through medication but through compartmentalization, acknowledgement that individual comfort held no significance against collective survival. Commanders made triage decisions that condemned some to death so others might live, their expressions revealing no emotion as they calculated maximum preservation with the same detachment they might have applied to ammunition allocation or fuel conservation. This was not callousness but clarity recognition that sentiment represented unaffordable luxury when reality itself unraveled around them. On the surface below, where evacuation remained impossible for the vast majority, Cadia's defenders enacted the final phase of their 10,000-year vigil. Lord Castellan Creed, having overseen the extraction of those personnel and resources deemed strategically irreplaceable, issued his final directive with the same precision that had characterized his leadership throughout the campaign. The remaining military forces would continue resistance until physical dissolution rendered further action impossible, extracting maximum cost from the enemy even as the world died beneath their feet. This represented not futile gesture but fundamental principle duty fulfilled regardless of circumstance, purpose maintained beyond hope or reason. The Chaos forces pressing their advantage across the fragmenting landscape encountered resistance that defied rational explanation. Cadian shock troops maintained formation discipline despite ground that shifted beneath their feet, adjusting firing positions with mechanical precision as gravity fluctuated around them. Kaskin squads executed counterattacks against demon engine concentrations, utilizing reality distortions as tactical advantages rather than obstacles, by calculating trajectories that incorporated physical law variations. Even civilian support personnel, those deemed non-essential for evacuation priority, and converted maintenance tools to improvised weapons and joined defensive positions according to protocols established for exactly this contingency, the final stand that generations of Cadians had prepared for, but none had expected to personally execute. Throughout this dissolution, the Blackstone pylons continued their cascading failure across the planet's surface. Each collapse released energy in forms that defied conventional classification, creating phenomena visible across both physical and metaphysical spectrums. Imperial observers in evacuating vessels recorded light patterns that should have been imperceptible to human vision, yet registered directly on consciousness. Geometric configurations that changed the thought patterns of those who witnessed them. Harmonic frequencies that resonated not through air but through reality itself. The Mechanicus research teams, those deemed sufficiently valuable for priority evacuation, compiled measurements that would occupy their successors for centuries to come, data describing not merely a planet's death but reality's reconfiguration. As the pylons failed, the barrier between real space and the immaterium, always thin in the region of the Cadian Gate, but maintained through the ancient structure's stabilizing influence, deteriorated beyond recovery threshold. The process manifested initially in localized reality failures, zones where physical laws operated differently or ceased function entirely, boundaries where material and immaterial realms overlapped, creating environments where both existed simultaneously, temporal distortions that caused events to occur out of sequence or repeat in endless loops. These anomalies, initially isolated to regions surrounding collapsed pylons, spread and connected as the failure cascade accelerated, creating expanding networks of unreality that consumed the material world like metaphysical cancer. Above this apocalyptic dissolution, Abaddon the Despoiler observed from the command deck of the Planet Killer with the cold satisfaction of one who has pursued a single objective across a time frame exceeding normal human comprehension. The destruction of Cadia represented not merely elimination of physical obstacle but culmination of strategic plan extending across all 13 Black Crusades. Each previous campaign laying groundwork for this final execution regardless of apparent outcome. The pylons, whose destabilization now progressed toward inevitable conclusion, had always been his primary target. Their relationship to the stability of the barrier between real space and the warp, representing vulnerability that could, if properly exploited, transform not merely the Cadian Gate, but the Imperium itself. The will of eternity, that ancient Blackstone fortress whose weapon had delivered the critical blow against Cadia's heart, maintained position above the primary impact zone as though monitoring the consequences of its action. Energy continued to play across its surface in patterns matching those observed in the failing pylons below, suggesting synchronization beyond coincidental correlation. This relationship, documented by Mechanicus observation craft during their desperate ascent, confirmed theories regarding the common origin of these technologies. Both Blackstone pylons and Blackstone fortresses represented artifacts from civilization that had understood and manipulated the barrier between dimensions in ways the Imperium had only begun to comprehend, their operation governed by principles that transcended conventional scientific categorization. As the 66th day dawned, the last dawn, Cadia would witness the planet's core destabilized. Not through conventional tectonic processes, but through metaphysical corruption that altered its fundamental composition. Mechanicus Auspex arrays detected transmutation occurring at the atomic level, elements converting into substances that should not have existed within material universe parameters. This transformation accelerated outward from the core in concentric waves, each converting additional matter into forms hostile to conventional physical law. The mathematical progression indicated complete planetary conversion within hours, transforming what had been mankind's bulwark against chaos into something that defied categorization within imperial scientific or theological frameworks. In the face of this unprecedented dissolution, evacuation operations entered their terminal phase. The remaining vessels, their capacity already exceeded by desperate passengers, executed final retrieval patterns to extract highest priority assets from the planet's surface. These operations, conducted within an environment where conventional physical laws had become unreliable, demonstrated both the pinnacle of Imperial void-faring capability and its fundamental limitations when confronted with reality breakdown beyond designed parameters. Navigation occurred through instinct rather than calculation. Trajectories adjusted continuously as spatial relationships shifted around vessels in patterns that defied prediction. That any craft successfully completed extraction under these circumstances testified to human adaptability, transcending mechanical limitation. Among the final evacuees were those who would transform defeat into legacy, archive adepts carrying data cores containing the accumulated tactical knowledge of 10 millennia, their protective equipment modified to shield contents from reality distortion effects that corrupted standard information storage. Genitors preserving tissue samples from Cadian bloodlines, ensuring that the unique adaptations developed across generations of warp proximity could be maintained even if the population itself perished. Most significantly, senior officers whose mental conditioning had incorporated strategic understanding beyond explicit documentation, human repositories of institutional knowledge that would prove invaluable in the conflicts to come as the Imperium confronted the consequences of Cadia's fall. On the surface below, where evacuation remained impossible for the vast majority, the final act of resistance unfolded. Communications from these doomed defenders, transmitted through increasingly unreliable channels as conventional electromagnetic propagation became compromised by reality distortion, maintained the mechanical precision characteristic of Cadian military protocol. No lamentation contaminated these final reports, no emotional appeals undermined their factual content. They documented the enemy's movements, assessed tactical developments, and reported resource status with the same disciplined efficiency that had characterized Cadian operations throughout the 10,000-year vigil. Even at the threshold of extinction, they remained soldiers rather than victims, fulfilling purpose rather than awaiting fate. Lord Castellan Creed himself exemplified this spirit as he coordinated the final defense from a command post established in the ruins of what had once been Kasser Kraft's primary administratum complex. The strategic situation permitted no illusions regarding outcome, but his directives focused exclusively on process rather than result, maximum attrition imposed upon enemy forces, tactical adjustments to compensate for reality degradation, priority designation for remaining ammunition reserves. When expanding reality distortions rendered standard communication impossible, he continued issuing orders to those within physical voice range, maintaining command presence until physical dissolution rendered further action impossible. His final recorded words, captured by a failing Vox transmitter moments before the command post collapsed into unreality, epitomized the ethos that had sustained Cadia across millennia of resistance. While we yet stand, we fight. As the planet's structural integrity approached terminal failure, a final attempt to preserve victory from overwhelming defeat materialized in the void above. The surviving vessels of Battlefleet Cadia, those that had maintained desperate holding action against superior Chaos naval forces throughout the evacuation, executed synchronized attack run against the will of eternity. This operation, conceived and ordered by Lord Admiral Quarren aboard his disintegrating flagship, represented not merely tactical adjustment, but symbolic statement denial of uncontested triumph to an enemy who had pursued this objective across 10 millennia of hatred. That the mathematical probability of success registered below measurable parameters held no relevance against the imperative that Cadia's fall extract maximum cost until its final moment. The void battle that followed demonstrated both the pinnacle of Imperial naval capability and its ultimate inadequacy against archaeotech of sufficient advancement. Cruisers and battleships executed approach vectors that should have been impossible given their mass and maneuverability limitations, their machine spirits seemingly transcending mechanical constraints through sheer determination. Point defense batteries achieved accuracy metrics exceeding theoretical maximums despite targeting systems compromised by reality distortion effects. Most significantly, command crews maintained coordination through intuitive understanding where communication systems failed, executing complex maneuvers without explicit direction through shared purpose that bordered on collective consciousness. Against this unprecedented display of human determination, the Will of Eternity brought to bear capabilities that transcended conventional defensive classification. Energy fields manifested around its perimeter, not as standard void shields, but as localized reality reinforcement, creating zones where physical laws operated with such rigid enforcement that approaching vessels found their own systems compromised by the transition between distorted and hypernormal space. Weapon systems activated not through mechanical triggering but apparent response to threat assessment conducted at processing speeds exceeding cogitator capability, targeting solutions executed before tactical officers could register target acquisition. Most significantly, the fortress itself seemed to exist partially outside conventional spatial parameters, sections disappearing and reappearing according to patterns that defied prediction or countermeasure. Despite these overwhelming advantages, the Imperial assault extracted measurable cost. A Nova-class frigate, its reactor deliberately pushed beyond containment parameters by engineering crew who remained at their posts despite lethal radiation exposure, collided with a peripheral weapon array after its commanding officer calculated trajectory that utilized reality distortions to bypass outer defensive perimeters. The resulting detonation created cascade failure through connected systems, temporarily reducing the fortress's defensive capability along specific approach vectors. Into this momentary vulnerability pressed 3 Cobra-class destroyers in sequence, each sacrificing itself to create progressive damage that expanded the initial breach, their crews accepting certainty of death to create possibility of meaningful impact. The culmination of this sacrificial attack sequence came when the Vengeance, Lord Admiral Quarren's disintegrating flagship, executed ramming maneuver directly into the breach created by its smaller companions. The vessel, already compromised beyond sustainable operational parameters by accumulated battle damage, drove itself into the Blackstone fortress with sufficient momentum to penetrate multiple internal layers before structural failure rendered further progress impossible. The collision created visible disruption throughout the Will of Eternity, energy fluctuations cascading across its surface in patterns indicating significant internal damage. For a brief moment, it appeared that Imperial sacrifice might achieve meaningful strategic impact despite overwhelming technological disadvantage. This hope proved short-lived. The Blackstone Fortress, despite damage that would have destroyed conventional vessel of any classification, demonstrated self-repair capability exceeding even theoretical models developed by the most optimistic Mechanicus assessments. The energy disruptions stabilized, damaged, sections regenerated through processes that appeared to involve matter reconfiguration rather than conventional reconstruction, and operational capability returned to baseline parameters within time frame that rendered the sacrificial attack sequence ultimately futile in practical terms. What remained significant was not outcome but the refusal to yield despite certainty of defeat that had characterized Imperial resistance throughout the conflict. Below this final void engagement, Cadia itself approached terminal structural failure. The planet's crust had fragmented completely, tectonic plates drifting apart to reveal the transforming core beneath. The atmosphere vented into space through these massive fissures, creating visible trails that extended outward from the dying world like blood spatter frozen in vacuum. Gravity fluctuated beyond any predictable pattern, alternately crushing surface features into dense compression masses and flinging debris outward at velocities approaching significant fraction of light speed. Most significantly, The barrier between real space and the immaterium, maintained for millennia by the Blackstone pylons, now completely failed, collapsed entirely, creating permanent warp breach where stable planetary body had once existed. The immediate consequences extended far beyond Cadia itself. Throughout surrounding space, reality shuddered in sympathetic resonance with the planet's destruction. Stable warp routes that had permitted reliable navigation for millennia dissolved or reconfigured, rendering established passage through the Cadian Gate impossible without accepting probability of translation failure exceeding 97%. Astropathic communications across multiple sectors experienced disruption beyond standard parameters. Messages corrupted with information never transmitted by their originators or arriving at destinations bearing no relationship to intended recipients. Most significantly, the breach itself expanded outward from its origin point, creating what subsequent Imperial classification would designate as the Cicatrix Maledictum, a warp storm of unprecedented scale that would effectively bisect the Imperium. As these cosmic consequences unfolded across scale that defied comprehensive monitoring, the final moments of Cadia itself played out in apocalyptic dissolution. The planet's remaining mass, those fragments not yet converted to incomprehensible substances or flung into space by gravitational fluctuations, collapsed inward toward the transformed core. This collapse occurred not through conventional gravitational attraction, but through metaphysical reconfiguration, reality itself, folding inward like crumpled parchment, carrying physical matter along its distorted dimensions. The process accelerated beyond measurement capability of observing instruments, culminating in implosion that momentarily created region of absolute negation, where planet had once existed before expanding, outward again as pure warp manifestation. What remained afterward defied classification within established imperial scientific or theological frameworks. Not merely debris field or empty space, but wound in reality itself, region where the barrier between dimensions had not merely thinned but dissolved completely, where material and immaterial realms existed in superposition rather than separation. The Cadian Gate, that narrow corridor of relative stability that had permitted passage near the Eye of Terror for millennia uncounted, no longer existed in any meaningful sense. In its place yawned new abyss that would transform navigation, communication, and strategic reality throughout the Imperium for generations to come. Among the vessels that escaped this unprecedented cataclysm, carrying precious few survivors compared to the billions sacrificed, a transformation occurred that would prove more significant than mere physical preservation. The Cadian spirit, that distinctive combination of disciplined resolve, uncompromising duty, and absolute refusal to yield regardless of circumstance, transcended the destruction of its physical source. It manifested not as abstract concept but as practical methodology, carried forward by survivors integrated into military formations throughout the Imperium. The distinctive combat doctrines, command protocols, and tactical innovations developed across 10 millennia of continuous war spread outward from their point of origin, transplanted by living carriers who embodied the principles they transmitted. Most visible among these spiritual inheritors were the surviving Cadian regiments themselves. These units, some evacuated largely intact and others reconstructed from fragments gathered across multiple vessels, maintained their distinctive identity despite the destruction of their homeworld. They continued wearing their traditional olive drab and khaki uniforms, field stripping their lasguns with the same mechanical precision taught by their ancestors, drilling in formation patterns developed for defensive positions that no longer existed. More significantly, they preserved the institutional memory of their planet, the accumulated tactical knowledge, historical understanding, and cultural practices that had sustained Cadia throughout its long vigil. Through their continued service, something of the fortress world endured beyond its physical destruction. Beyond these formal military units, individual Cadians scattered across the Imperium carried their heritage into new contexts. Officers seconded to other regiments brought with them command methodologies refined through centuries of practical application against mankind's most implacable enemies. Specialists transferred to Schola Progenium facilities transmitted technical knowledge that would otherwise have been lost with their world's destruction. Even common troopers, reassigned to bolster understrength formations throughout neighboring sectors, influenced their new companions through demonstrated example rather than explicit instruction, their disciplined performance establishing standards that elevated those around them through natural emulation. This diaspora carried physical artifacts as well as intangible heritage. Weapons and equipment salvaged during evacuation, often representing patterns specific to Cadian manufacture, found their way into armories throughout the segmentum. Technical manuals preserved by archive adepts provided templates that would influence Imperial military production for generations to come. Most significantly, the genetic legacy preserved by Mechanicus biologist teams ensured that the distinctive adaptations developed through proximity to the Eye of Terror, the capability to withstand warp influence that had made Cadians particularly resistant to chaos corruption, would remain available for future application even after their source population had been reduced to fraction of its former numbers. From these scattered seeds, something new yet fundamentally connected to its origins began to grow. The phrase "Cadia stands" transformed from tactical status report to spiritual affirmation, adopted by Imperial forces with no direct connection to the fallen fortress world. It appeared in devotional graffiti scrawled on bunker walls across 100 battlefields, in regimental mottos of newly founded guard formations, in unofficial additions to standard Imperial Guard oaths of moment. The words expressed not geographical reality but philosophical position, the absolute refusal to yield regardless of circumstance that had defined Cadian existence, now transplanted beyond its birthplace to take root throughout the Imperium. This transformation found its most potent expression in Saint Celestine, whose manifestation during Cadia's final defense represented both divine intervention and symbolic embodiment of principles transcending physical preservation. The living saint, appearing subsequently on battlefields throughout the fragmented Imperium, carried with her something of Cadia's spirit, the unwavering determination, the clarity of purpose, the refusal to acknowledge defeat even when reality itself seemed to demand it. Through her continued manifestation, the essence of what Cadia had represented remained active force within the Imperium rather than mere historical memory, influencing events in tangible fashion despite the destruction of its physical source. Across the void, in the twisted realm that had once been designated the Eye of Terror but now extended far beyond its original boundaries, Abaddon the Despoiler contemplated victory 10,000 years in making. The destruction of Cadia represented not merely elimination of long-standing obstacle but fundamental transformation of strategic landscape throughout the segmentum. The Cicatrix Maledictum, that massive warp storm created through the planet's metaphysical dissolution, effectively bisected the Imperium, creating separation that would severely compromise coordination between Terra and its distant holdings. This accomplishment, pursued with patience exceeding human comprehension, validated the methodical approach demonstrated throughout all 13 Black Crusades, regardless of their apparent individual outcomes. Yet even in this moment of unprecedented triumph, something remained incomplete. The physical planet had been destroyed, its defenders killed or scattered, its strategic position transformed from bulwark to breach point. But the idea of Cadia, the concept it had represented throughout its long vigil, proved more resilient than its material form. Reports filtering back through the twisted channels of chaos intelligence indicated that survivors carried something of the fortress world's spirit with them, transplanting its essence to new contexts throughout the Imperium. This spiritual persistence represented not defeat of Abaddon's ultimate objective, qualification of his victory. The physical obstacle had been removed, but the metaphysical resistance it embodied continued in altered form. 73 days after the silence first descended across the Cadian sector, as Imperial forces throughout the segmentum struggled to comprehend the strategic implications of unprecedented disaster, a curious phenomenon manifested across multiple battlefields. Regiments with no historical connection to Cadia began incorporating elements of its tactical doctrine into their operations. Command officers who had never visited the fortress world found themselves issuing orders that reflected its distinctive strategic approach. Most significantly, troops facing overwhelming chaos forces adopted the phrase that had defined Cadian resistance across 10 millennia of continuous war, the simple declaration that rejected despair regardless of circumstance. Cadia stands. Not geographical statement but philosophical position, not description of physical reality, but declaration of spiritual determination. The words carried power beyond their literal meaning, transforming what might have been catastrophic collapse of morale in the face of unprecedented defeat into stubborn persistence, despite overwhelming evidence that conventional victory had become impossible. This transformation, occurring simultaneously across battlefields separated by distances that should have prevented coordination, suggested something beyond strategic adjustment, a form of collective psychological response that transcended standard, imperial command structures and communication networks. In the fragmented Imperium left behind by Cadia's destruction and the Cicatrix Maledictum's formation, this spiritual resilience would prove more valuable than any physical resource or tactical advantage. The ability to continue resistance beyond hope or reason, to maintain purpose when strategic objective had become unattainable, to extract meaning from sacrifice regardless of outcome. These qualities, exemplified by Cadia throughout its long vigil, provided foundation for continued imperial coherence despite unprecedented fragmentation. The fortress world had fallen, but the example it established endured beyond its physical destruction, shaping the Imperium's response to catastrophe in ways that would determine mankind's survival in the dark era to follow. In this sense, the final victory belonged neither to Abaddon nor to the Imperium, but to Cadia itself, to the idea it had represented throughout 10 millennia of continuous war. The physical planet had been destroyed, its defenders scattered or slain, its strategic position transformed from bulwark to breachpoint. But its essential nature, the stubborn refusal to yield regardless of circumstance, the absolute commitment to duty fulfilled without consideration of outcome, the clarity that found purpose in resistance itself rather than in its results continued beyond physical dissolution. Cadia had fallen, but Cadia stood eternal in the only place that truly mattered, the collective will of humanity that continued resistance despite overwhelming evidence that conventional victory had become impossible. The final legacy of Cadia manifested not in triumph, but in endurance, not in conventional victory, but in the refusal to acknowledge defeat even when reality itself seemed to demand it. This legacy spread outward from the point of catastrophe like ripples from stone cast into still water, carried by survivors whose physical displacement belied their spiritual coherence. Through their continued service, through the example they established and the knowledge they preserved, something of the fortress world survived beyond its material destruction. Not merely memory but active principle, not merely historical record but ongoing methodology, not merely inspiration but practical implementation of values forged through 10 millennia of continuous war. 7 days after Cadia's destruction, as imperial forces throughout the fragmented Imperium struggled to establish new defensive positions against chaos incursions pouring through the breach where the Cadian gate had once stood, a Mechanicus observation vessel recorded curious phenomenon at the catastrophe site. Among the debris field and reality distortions that marked the planet's former location, geometric patterns appeared spontaneously in three-dimensional space configurations, identical to those observed on the Blackstone pylons during their final destabilization phase. These patterns, visible across both physical and metaphysical spectrums, persisted briefly before dissolving back into the chaotic energy discharges characteristic of the region. Their significance remained unclear, though subsequent Mechanicus analysis suggested possible remnant programming executing incomplete function cycles within environment incompatible with designed operational parameters. Whether this phenomenon indicated some fragment of Cadia's physical essence surviving beyond its apparent destruction, some echo of the ancient technology that had sustained it throughout its long vigil, or merely random energy discharge within region of extreme reality distortion, remained undetermined. What required no interpretation was the broader truth. It symbolized that something of Cadia endured beyond its material dissolution, that its influence continued to manifest in detectable fashion despite catastrophic physical destruction. The fortress world had not merely existed as geographical location or military installation, but as nexus point where humanity's stubborn defiance confronted the universe's fundamental entropy, where disciplined order stood against chaotic dissolution regardless of mathematical probability. In this final analysis, Cadia represented not merely planetary body or strategic position, but idea given physical form, the concept that duty transcends circumstance, that purpose derives not from outcome but from commitment itself, that resistance retains meaning regardless of conventional victory or defeat. This idea, forged through 10 millennia of continuous war against mankind's greatest existential threat, survived the destruction of its physical vessel to spread throughout the Imperium at precisely the moment when such spiritual fortification became most critically necessary. The fortress world had fallen, but the bulwark it represented, the human capacity for determined resistance beyond hope or reason, stood eternal. Cadia stands,